Chapter 1111. It was like the sudden opening of a 0 yuan purchase in hell. It was good news enough to double the stock price. Once became 5 times. The lifespan of the tool man had been increased by more than doubling. Congratulations. Huaisher felt that his price-performance ratio was beginning to exceed. He just didn't know if there would be any gifts if he placed an order now. That's really great news. He sighed without emotion. I'm so happy that I can't close my mouth. The greater the trouble, the greater the responsibility, Huaisher. The honest man Isaac couldn't ignore his conscience. After a long silence, he sighed. It's a pity that so many things prepared before can't be used. It's my duty, Mr. Isaac. Huaisher shook his head. You do your job, and I do mine. The rest will be left to the rest. So, my job is not to wander aimlessly on the chessboard to annoy others, right? After a moment of silence, Isaac replied dryly, part of it is correct. Wander or annoy others. The short pause didn't last long. Isaac continued calmly. You need to look for something? In this deserted world, the closest thing to you should be in the city you are in. He changed the subject. Huaisher was stunned, but it was too late to complain. He heard the word from Isaac. You should be able to perceive that one of the things that can shake this world is hidden in the ruins of the city under your feet. In silence, Huaisher turned back. He looked at the deepest part of Frozen City. It was a collapsed tall building covered by ice and snow, and something hidden in the shadow of the tall building. It didn't call out, nor did it show any magic. But of course, there was a sense of huge existence that couldn't be ignored. Like the biggest and reddest button among countless buttons, its undoubted uniqueness made it stand out from the ruins and attract everyone's attention. What happens after you find it? Huaisher asked. This is what I can promise you, Huaisher. Isaac replied. It's just like I said, you can get whatever you want. It's the same logic. The meaning behind his words was already obvious. There was no need to care about the Continuation Academy or the war situation. Once you get it, it's all yours. After the short communication, Huaisher looked back at the battlefield behind him. The high temperature was still rising, and the residual heat had not dissipated. Unfortunately, the long-awaited warmth was unable to awaken the vitality that had long passed away. It only dissipated in vain in the cold wind. It was a waste. Huaisher casually cut his own finger. Drops of blood dripped down, sinking into the earth that was still warm. Soon, strange flowers and shrubs grew in this city that had been dead for a long time. Absorbing the residual warmth from the surface, the flowers from hell grew rapidly, forming a temporary and brilliant sea of flowers. After covering all the corpses of the hell creatures, the flowers quickly withered, shrank, and returned to Huaisher's feet. They wrapped around his wrist and formed a slightly charming garland bracelet. With the replenishment of these vitality, at least he did not have to worry about the cold wind and exhaustion. He nodded in satisfaction. He sighed silently. Now he finally understood why the Continuation Academy spared no effort to find so many different people to participate in this, including himself, Shang Quan, Liz, the Vice-Chancellor, the Lotus Emperor, Nanin's mother, and even more people he had never seen before. At this moment, each of the chess pieces here had enough cases of the weak defeating the strong, above a fixed number of performance above the standard. Whether it was luck or skill or performance that others could not reach, or in human control of the situation, or perhaps it was simply an unreasonable cheat such as Supreme, and each of them had more than one infinite world card, storing their different periods and different states of themselves, witnessing the miracles and great achievements they had established, coupled with the consciousness and soul that had long surpassed the past. After understanding this, he couldn't help but shudder. Now, the Sword Saint Shang Quan, who had reached the pinnacle of swordsmanship and whose attainments no one could pry and measure, had regained a young body, coupled with the various supreme that he had. And that swordsmanship that was enough to kill gods and spirits with just a long sword. It was simply a nightmare. Above the distant sky, the dull thunder resounded again. Also, some kind of chill that made Huaisher's hair stand on end was brewing in the distant area that he could not pry into, rising into the sky. At this moment, a long distance away, on the wilderness that was full of bones, a rain of blood poured down. Countless calamities rapidly converged in the clouds and transformed. The lightning palace was like a monster's embryo. There was a strange silhouette rapidly growing in the clouds. Rain of blood, fission of bones, realm of nothingness. 3 overlapping spell cards endlessly stirred the cloud-filled sky, sprinkling a downpour of blood rain. Thousands of thick limbs slowly stretched out from the depths of the clouds. In the ear-piercing cry, the limbs casually clawed at the ground below, easily tearing apart the rocks, stone halls, soil, and other things. After leaving behind deep cracks, it came to an abrupt end. It paused on the spot. Then, the crisp sound of a sword being unsheathed burst out from the ground. The downpour of blood rain disappeared without a trace, as if it was cut in half. The monster that had yet to be born from the thunderclouds let out a piercing scream. Countless thick limbs were cut from the middle, the cut as smooth as a mirror, falling to the ground. In the end, a straight and sharp slash mark appeared above the thundercloud. Soon, the sky was filled with blood rain, thunderclouds, and even monsters. Under the sword, they all disappeared. Only a few huge limbs that were rapidly decaying were left, like weathered boulders, rolling and tumbling pathetically. At this moment, on the blood-stained wilderness, only the young man with the feather weave was left, and the long sword in his hand that could not bear the burden and had cracks on it. A mere celestial phenomenon is not worth mentioning. The sword saint raised his hand, stretched his overly young fingers, and smiled. Although the tool is useless, such a young body is really refreshing. Mountain beheading wanderer Shang Quan. 20 years old? No, 17 years old. Unfortunately, I'm not 40 years old. When I was a teenager, I still neglected to exercise. He clenched his fists, and blue veins appeared on his arms and shoulders that were full of cuts. Soon, they disappeared under the skin. He did not care about those insignificant things. Stepping over the remaining bones of the enemy, he stepped forward. Just like that, he walked into the collapsed mountain in a grand manner. After passing through the countless skeletal frames that looked like birdhouses, he saw the resplendent object in the deepest part of the deep pool. It was like the ultimate color that could be mixed with melted gold and diamonds, changing and shining. Is this the so-called blood of Gaia? After a moment of silence, he murmured in realization, "It does seem like the arrival of a special reward. However, isn't this temptation a little too strong?" At this moment, in his eyes, the gorgeous color and light were reflected. It was as if the world itself had shown the source of its own mystery to the visitor, revealing the creation and destruction of all things, and showing endless possibilities and changes. It was a question that went straight to the heart. What is it that you want? Well, I want strength, power, and influence? Women or swordsmanship? No, those were just insignificant embellishments, and it was not even enough to waste a moment of thought. When he was young, he longed for the power to dominate the world. When he was young, he longed for the beauty that he could share weal and woe with. When he was middle-aged, he wanted to have the power to make the whole world surrender. But when he was old and witnessed many changes and the vicissitudes of life, he would understand that those were not what he wanted. In the end, even the swords that grew on the side of the body ushered in their own end. At the end of this lonely road, he was the only one left. What I want is a sword that I can use. That's enough. At that moment, accompanied by the sigh of the sword saint, a tear-like sparkling arc emerged from his fingertips. As if it had heard his wish, the world generously donated. A simple and unadorned long sword quietly appeared at his waist. The blade of the sword sighed sadly and trembled slightly. A silent low hum. At that moment, on the huge fragment of Gaia, dragons and snakes rose, and the earth trembled. Accompanied by a deafening sound, the dry wilderness disappeared from the center of the chessboard. It appeared at the other end of the reality. In the decision-making room, there were cheers of suppressed excitement, and many people clenched their fists in excitement. They want a city first. It's a pity that the Egyptians didn't come to such a grand event. In front of the chessboard, the smoking gambler shrugged. I always feel that they're good at playing cards. This cold joke, like all his previous cold jokes, didn't get the audience's appreciation. In the silence, other than the glow of the world of cards, there was only the huge change that enveloped the entire domain in the fragment of old Gaia. As one card after another was thrown into it, countless miracles and disasters intertwined with each other, condensing into forms and descending upon it continuously. And in the observation of the reality, the correction value and distortion were also surging rapidly. The success of the worship of the Sword Saint had led the correction value by a large margin, reaching the range of 1%. At this moment, the blood of Gaia, hidden in the fragment, was still hiding its glow. That might be the last gift and essence of Mother Earth. The blood left in the reality. This showdown and bet between the reality and the abyss was no longer a mere game, but a reconfiguration of the entire world under the control of the chess player. With countless cards representing the records of both sides fighting again and again, using the purest victory and defeat to redefine everything in this world. It was like a tug of war. Did it belong to the reality or hell? At this moment, there was another loud roar from the chessboard. The waning man from India, Onidru, gripped his cards tightly, his face ashen. A small mistake, and the tables were turned. He watched helplessly as his spoils of war were grasped in the hands of hell. The maze-like city fell to the other end of hell. Another city was lost in the huge palace, a magnificent golden light condensed into a dazzling halo above the head of the hunting angel. A pair of wings spread out from his back. The Paradise of Blessings card set. Saint of Hell, Praiser. Outside the chessboard, Archangel Righteousness nodded in satisfaction and gave another order. Thus, after devouring all of the enemies, the gentle face once again lifted up and wiped away the blood at the corner of its mouth. It cheerfully stepped into the open door in front of it. On the other side of the door was the ruins of the city in a world of ice and snow. Chapter 11-12. In less than half an hour after the start of the game, the war between the present realm and Inferno had begun within the chessboard, where time was accelerated. So fast, in the decision-making room, Russell tapped his fingers on the table and sighed softly. It was hard to understand. Wasn't the Continuation Academy's style too radical this time? It was too fast, faster than expected. After the fourth round, the two sides began to fight and kill each other in the middle of the game. Step by step. In addition to Dongxia, who took the lead, America, India, and even the Russian Federation had also placed all their important economic structures on the edge of the battlefield and began to fight fiercely. In contrast, the celestial genealogy, which used to be headstrong and reckless, was now together with the Indian genealogy, staying at the back of the battlefield and developing unhurriedly, which was shocking. However, Isaac's tactics were inspired by Russell, so he wasn't in a hurry. After saving up the dragon, summoning Flute and Anubis, wouldn't he be able to fight wherever he wanted? Besides, wasn't there still a Huaishir outside? Keeping this scourge at home would only drag down the economy. So, throwing him out to the other side as a cancer was the right way to use him. However, it was the tactics adopted by the Abyss that made Russell a little confused. The two sides seemed to have been completely switched. The ascendants of the present realm began to advance rapidly, while the rulers of the Abyss began to fight steadily. Did they take the wrong script from a reality show? I really don't understand. Russell looked back at the mystic bird and instigated, "What do you think?" How to look at it was another matter. The key was, why don't you take a look at it with the eyes of the stars? I'm not looking. The mystic bird obviously knew what Russell was up to. She sat as still as a mountain. Anyway, I'm not the one going up. I've done what I can. How can I command the front line from the rear? But there aren't many times you've completely left things alone, right? Russell asked in return, since we're so familiar with each other, can you disclose any arrangements in advance? When the people around heard this, their ears seemed to stand up. Even the feathered serpent couldn't help but glance back. As for the mystic bird, it sat steadily without moving. You're about to retire. Why are you worrying so much? Xian Niao glanced at Russell meaningfully. He didn't know who this sentence without a subject was referring to. What about Bai Zhe? Russell asked. He hasn't played yet. He can't be a decoration in the reserve team, right? Do you want me to go on stage if I'm not just a decoration? Xian Niao calmly drank his tea and then threw out a piece of news that made everyone's eyeballs fall to the ground. She doesn't know how to play cards. If you wanted to talk about eating, drinking, traveling, taking selfies, talking about cats, and playing with dogs, she was good at it. Maybe she could even share her experience with you. As for the rest, just forget about it. Speaking of this, Mystic Bird clearly recalled the painful past where she had to reimburse the other party for anti-hypertensive drugs every time she worked with someone. Mystic Bird's expression became hesitant. After hearing this, Russell couldn't help but look up at his student on the screen. For some reason, he felt the same helplessness as Xian Yao. He patted the old man's shoulder, and the two of them sighed and sipped their tea. He stopped looking. He was mentally exhausted. Until now, Golden Dawn is still not willing to put in more effort. On the opposite side of the chessboard, Gongyi under the armor glanced at Mathers beside him. Isn't he a little too lazy? Mathers smiled calmly and let the Russian genealogy take away the strategic point that was at his fingertips. He threw down another land card without a care in the world. But with hard work, there is a reward. Sir, the time spent working hard is always long. But where is your reward? Gongyi asked. Don't worry, it's not time yet, Mathers calmly replied. He noticed the cold eyes of his teammates around him, and he seemed to feel that he had been too lazy. Finally, he didn't waste time like before. After taking out a card from his pile of cards, he threw it into the battlefield without looking at it. However, before the crops are ruined, let's put 2 scarecrows in the field. Along with his words, the clouds were torn apart by a shining golden light. A huge, deep pit suddenly appeared on the ground that was covered by the fog. A skinny and silent figure slowly climbed out of it. Barefoot, he stepped into the flowing poisonous water, allowing it to sizzle. But his expression was calm and almost solemn, as if he couldn't feel any pain. His messy beard fluttered in the wind. He looked haggard. Right in front of the holy temple, the middle-aged monk slowly raised his eyes and raised his hand. His 5 fingers curled into a seal and extended towards the ground. Bang! Then the ground wailed, and thousands of cracks appeared out of nowhere. It was as if a big mouth suddenly appeared from the ground. It opened and instantly swallowed the Russian Federation's holy temple, along with the enemy inside. There was no time to resist or even react. Amidst the rumbling, the ground slowly closed. Only the numbing sound of cracking could be heard from the ground, and blood spurted out from the soil. And the thing that caused all this was just an ordinary bronze frame world card. There wasn't even a name on it. Ascetic, or perhaps he could call the owner of this card by another name that was even more awe-inspiring to the deaf. The Heretic King. It's just the land of bliss. The giant hammer was swung around, setting off a storm of blood in the crowd of hell. A burly figure stepped on the bones of hell creatures and slowly walked out of the battlefield. Behind him was a tragic scene, with blood flowing everywhere. Leaning on the hammer in his hand, the young man shook his head in disdain. He combed his messy hair to the back of his head and let out a long sigh. Although his muscles were well-defined, and he looked handsome and dignified, his coquettish appearance still made people want to hit him. Giant Whale Wang Abeo, or rather, the young Kwafu. At such a young age, he had already grown to look like nobody wanted him. Abeo, don't be coquettish, okay? Your legs are about to break. Chaos, who was playing chess, reminded him expressionlessly, don't pose. Help from the left. You still have teammates. Brother Kwafu, I carry him here, okay? Kwafu dragged the hammer indifferently and rushed to the place of support. He complained, just the support is enough. Don't bring so many people here. They're in the way. Forget it, just don't drag me down. Before he finished speaking, he felt a strong wind above his head. After a loud noise, the bone spell giant, which was several meters tall, flew into the air. After smashing 2 walls, it smashed into pieces on the stone tablet. Through the gap, one could see the fierce battle scene inside. Under the crystal glow of Gaia's blood, almost countless hell creatures occupied the entire interior of the palace. The towering bone spell giants roared and kept pouncing on a slender figure, but they were all destroyed by the lone girl with iron fists. Oh my God, neck killing hand, leg throwing. It's rare to see such beautiful Wing Chun in this day and age. Kwafu stuck his head out and exclaimed, especially when he saw the girl's beautiful yet cold face and her starry eyes. He couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. Hey, Kwafu widened his eyes. When did Dongxia have such a beautiful girl? Hey, Chaos tried to stop him. But under the impulse of his instinct to seek a mate, Kwafu had already roared, grabbed the hammer, and jumped into the battlefield recklessly. He shouted at the girl who was besieged, "Little girl, don't be afraid. I'll protect you." In an instant, he smashed the giants, blocking the way with his hammer. He went all the way forward. After killing the entire formation, he turned around and rushed back as if he was showing off. 7 in and 7 out. It was as if he had entered a place where no one could stop him, until all the large groups were smashed to pieces under the hammer. In the pool of blood, only Kwafu, who was covered in wounds, proudly put his hands on his hips and laughed. "How are you? Are you okay?" He patted his chest and asked, "Oh, I'm late. Otherwise, how can my teammates be besieged?" "Don't worry, leave it to me. I'll keep you safe." The girl was stunned for a moment. She nodded and thanked him. "Thank you so much." "You're welcome." Kwafu came over, rubbed his hands, and asked with a flattering smile, "By the way, how should I address you?" "Ami?" The girl was stunned for a moment, as if she was thinking. "Juju," she replied. "Juju," which means 2 jades in a match. "Juju. Haha, it sounds like, well, it sounds good." Kwafu hummed and hawed for a long time, but he couldn't find any adjectives. He almost wrote, "I want to praise, but I don't know what to say," on his face. The girl looked at him helplessly. Finally, she couldn't help shaking her head and sighing. "You're injured. Let me treat you." She reached out and took out the needle bag, motioning Kwafu to sit down. Kwafu immediately felt warm in his heart. For so many years, he had been delivering water, repairing computers, and running errands for free. He had never enjoyed such treatment. He was almost moved to tears, especially when he felt the cold little hand caressing the wound on his back. He sucked in a breath of cold air with pleasure. However, he didn't know why, but there was a strange feeling faintly rising in his heart. Juju, Juju, or saw illusion. "I seem to have heard this name somewhere," he asked doubtfully. "I don't think so. After all, few people know it." Behind him, the girl sighed with melancholy. "Compared with the famous Kwafu, I can only be a nobody in Dongxia." No. He smiled honestly. Before he could say anything, he heard a faint sigh behind him. "Now, people generally like to call me Emperor Qing." The silence was sudden. In a daze, Kwafu turned his head stiffly, only to see the green light illuminating her expressionless face. Poison and vitality overlapped, forming the outline of the curse of Wood Demon. Juju with magical hands and poisonous heart. Chapter 11-13. In the decision-making room, Xian Niao's expression twitched. His hand that was holding the teacup trembled slightly. "Toothache. What the F***CK is going on? Why didn't I beat this embarrassing thing to death back then? How good would it be to end it all?" Originally, he had always thought that although Kwafu was a little silly, lazy, liked to court death, and lacked women, at least he was still a good child. He could still be saved. At most, he could teach him more setbacks. In the end, so many setbacks didn't wake this fool up at all. Now, he was courting death and flirting with Grandma's house. What was the seniority of the Qing Emperor's old lady? She was the elder that even Xian Niao had to greet as a junior when he saw her. Even his teacher, Lu Wu of the previous generation, had to call her elder sister obediently when he saw her. In the end, how could a fool like you walk on the road of death while singing and dancing? He couldn't even stop him. Did he really think that the wood spirit corpse forest behind Mount Yudai grew out of thin air? It seemed that the lesson from the sea reclamation I wasn't enough. Xian Niao held the teacup and made the future arrangements expressionlessly. When he came back, he would find an excuse to send him to let Tyr beat him up twice. In this regard, Kwafu and the Qing Emperor had joined forces. With their extraordinary output and defense, as well as unreasonable healing methods and recovery effects, there was no need to worry at all. On the other side, there was also the cooperation of Hundun and Baize, so he didn't need to worry. As for the field, he looked at the snowy, frozen city. He looked at the praises who had descended into the dead city and Huaishur who had walked into the building. Things were getting interesting. Under the light of the crystal lamp, the hall was filled with the fragrance of citrus. A soft melody echoed in his ears. Not far away, the sound of chatting and laughing came from the tea house and lounge. The warm wind blew in his face, making Huaishur in a daze for a moment. "Name?" The manager behind the front desk looked up and asked. Huaishur's expression twitched. He turned back and looked out of the window. Outside the window, the dead silent city in the ice and snow was like a ruin. The cold wind whimpered, and ice and snow fell endlessly from the sky. But when he raised his head and looked at everything in front of him again, he suddenly felt a sense of unreality. From the moment he stepped into this place, it was as if he had entered another world, another dream that should not have appeared here. Now, the character in his dream was standing in front of Huaishur. "Name, sir," the front desk manager asked politely. "Russell." Huaishur answered instantly. "All right, Mr. Huaishur." The front desk manager lowered his head to record. "Age? 90? More than 100? I didn't notice. Just think of me as an old man." Huaishur sighed. 19. The manager at the front desk continued to write. After looking up at him, he lowered his head and continued. "In terms of gender, it should be male." "Impudent. How dare you assume my gender?" Huaishur raised his eyebrows, almost writing the word exhausted on his face. But the smiling front desk manager still didn't care. He just pushed a black card in front of Huaishur. "It's a pity that we can no longer provide you with accommodation and catering services, but I guess you may not be here for this." The manager at the front desk nodded and said goodbye with a smile. "The elevator is on your right. The manager will receive you in the reception room on the top floor." In silence, Huaishur looked down at the black card on the table. After a long time, he sighed, picked it up, turned around, and walked toward the elevator. However, after taking 2 steps, he couldn't help but look back behind him. In the hotel lobby, where singing and dancing were thriving, soft music still echoed. "Hey, are you still alive?" he asked the front desk manager. The front desk manager, who lowered his head to deal with his work, smiled slightly and didn't answer. He just bent down and bowed with his hand on his chest. He respectfully sent him off. The elevator closed. Surrounded by the elegant, ancient style, Huaishur in the elevator felt that he was rising steadily. In the end, he stopped at the top. Outside the open elevator door, there was only one road. At the end of the red carpet, there was an open door. In front of the desk, a middle-aged man in a black suit stood upright and nodded slightly to the visitor. "Welcome, Mr. Huaishur. To be honest, I'm not sure whether this is an illusion or something else." Huaishur looked around, reached out, and touched the flower in the bottle. The flower seemed to feel the breath of the same origin and gave back real and subtle joy. It doesn't matter if it's an illusion left behind by the past. The manager smiled indifferently and gestured for Huaishur to sit down. "Lucky people like us have been blessed by miracles to be able to continue to this day by chance. Even if it becomes an illusion, it doesn't seem unacceptable." "What kind of test is this?" Huaishur asked curiously. "You issue a task, and I help you solve it. After that, you give me the thing, and I turn around and leave." "Ah?" The manager was stunned for a long time, as if he had found an unexpected path. "Can it be like this? Isn't it like this?" Huaishur was dumbfounded. "Of course not." The manager spread his hands. "Would a group of illusions from the past have any desires? Besides, what we want has already been given to me." When he said this, he showed a nostalgic smile. "In contrast, I'm more curious," the manager suddenly asked. "What do you want, Mr. Huaishur?" When the question was asked, the pair of calm eyes seemed to be filled with some kind of magnificent brilliance, reflecting Huaishur's soul and consciousness. A question that could not be refused. There was also no room for any lies, waiting for the answer that emerged from the deepest part of the soul. Then, The moment the answer emerged, he was stunned on the spot. "I want to live a happy life," Huaisha replied. Such a wish and desire made the surging blood of Gaia fall into stagnation and silence. Was it too insignificant or too greedy? It was difficult to evaluate, but it was not within the scope of realization. "That's too difficult, Mr. Huaisha." The manager wiped his sweat awkwardly. "Can you change it?" World peace?" Huaisha asked again tentatively. "Or erase hell?" The manager sighed again. "It's unrealistic no matter how you think about it." "That's right. It's a little beyond the scope." Huaisha scratched his head. "Let me think about it. This in such a short time, I can't think of anything even if you suddenly ask me." "It's okay. You can think about it seriously." The manager comforted him. "As long as you think of it, you can take that card and tell me at any time." After a short pause, he suddenly showed a sympathetic look. "However, I'm afraid you don't have much time." At that moment, Huaisha's body suddenly had a premonition of death. His 10 fingers contracted and suddenly clenched subconsciously. Within the domain of Supreme Symphony's perception, an unprecedented cacophony of noises appeared. A huge, strange rhythm, like a choir, suddenly inserted into the sound of the frozen city, and then quickly usurped the main position, eliminating all the noise. There was silence between heaven and earth. Only the last 2 sound sources were left. When Huaisha suddenly turned back and looked out of the window, he caught a glimpse of the huge figure that spread its wings from the ground and rose quickly. The praiser of the blessed land. And the praiser also looked at him. The pale face under the black robe showed an excited smile that belonged to a predator. When he waved his hand, there was a sound from the air that converged in one place and quickly converged. Then a sound like a scream burst out from his fingertips toward Huaisha. Like a giant cannon firing, it crossed a long distance in an instant and arrived in front of Huaisha. Huaisha drew his sword without hesitation and slashed. He felt the perceptual feedback from Supreme. It was completely different from his own symphony, but it seemed to be the same in a certain range. The nothingness and the emotions in it were given substance. The scream of despair collided with the blade of the sword of virtue, and sparks flew. Huaisha slid back a few meters. The illusion in front of him was finally defeated by the sudden and restless noise. The warmth, the incense, and even the elegant interior decoration disappeared without a trace, including the store manager. Only a skeleton covered in frost behind the long table was left in this dilapidated reception room. The store manager's brooch was pinned to the collar of the deceased who had long passed away. A faint sigh of regret flashed in the wind. But Huaisha had no time to sigh. A whistling sound broke through the air. After the gray-black figure brazenly destroyed several floors, it fell from the sky and smashed in front of Huaisha. Under the hood, the pale face slowly raised, and the corners of the mouth, stained with a trace of blood, showed a hungry smile. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Huaisha." The praiser nodded and greeted. "To be honest, I've been looking forward to this meeting for a long time. Well, after all, I'm very famous. It takes some time to make an appointment." Huaisha looked at the enemy in front of him, but he had no impression of him. He scratched his head in confusion. "Well, have we met before?" "Not really." The praiser shook his head and answered patiently. "You have always been unwilling to come to the headquarters of the Hell's Music Association. I have not had the chance to meet you because of work." As he spoke, he raised his hand and showed a scepter symbol surrounded by notes. Huaisha suddenly understood. A calamity musician. "Ah, we're colleagues. Why didn't you say so earlier? You scare me to death." He patted his head as if he had met an old friend in a foreign land and warmly greeted him. "Where do you work?" "The land of bliss." The praiser replied. "I work as a performer in the choir. It's a good place. It has beautiful mountains and clear waters. And you work under the element of destruction. You have a bright future." Huaisha clapped his hands and praised. "Brother, you have such good conditions. Are you married?" "I've been widowed for a long time." The praiser sighed. "Although I have 2 children, neither of them inherited any talent." "What a pity. Children and grandchildren have their own fortune." There are so many good places in the land of bliss. What's a pity? Huaishur comforted him. Brother, you are young and promising. Just find a few more wives and have a few more children in the future. We'll talk about it when we have the chance. The praiser shook his head and sighed sadly. I took the liberty to visit you this time because I have a request for you. Well said, well said. Huaishur patted his chest loudly. We are all calamity musicians. There is no such thing as a request. Just say it. To be honest, over the years, I have been concentrating on meditation and thinking hard to create a new movement for my Lord. Unfortunately, I encountered difficulties in the second movement and was stuck for a long time. That's why I came here specially. At that moment, a stench rushed over in the storm. The praiser grinned, revealing 4 sharp canine teeth. He no longer concealed the desire in his heart. Material. Waiting for him was the burning axe in Huaishur's hand. There is also a symphonic movement that, after accumulating power for a long time, made the entire frozen city sing. Concerto of 4 Seasons, Winter. Chapter 11:14. The sharp claws collided with the burning axe blade. A huge force burst out, and the entire building shook. Both sides couldn't help but take a step back. The impact from the axe blade and the turbulence of the source substance made Huaishur's vision go black. The axe of wrath, which had not undergone transformation, could not withstand the praiser's mutated claws. In other words, there were drops of black, viscous liquid dripping down from the pitch-black stave on the mutated claws. The eternal pain was like venom spreading along with it. But now, the claws that had been burned by wrath were quickly covered with a layer of white frost. Frozen. The praiser was stunned for a moment and looked at Huaishur. Under the young man's feet, layers of frost appeared and slowly spread in the performance formed by the cold wind and blizzard. With the understanding of Yun Zhongjuan's interference with the 4 seasons, the symphony performance had directly triggered the celestial phenomenon of Frozen City. This was the next level of supreme after experiencing the advancement and the guidance of Shang Quan. No, even if peers are looking forward to death, it shouldn't be like this, right? Huaishur asked helplessly. Weren't we talking quite happily just now? Why did you turn hostile so suddenly? Oh, didn't you already agree? I have a request for material. The praiser licked the frost on his fingertips and savored the residual taste of the axe of wrath. He gradually became intoxicated. Why don't you fulfill my wish? I will definitely remember your generous sponsorship. In the reflection of those scarlet eyes, the young man in front of him surged with a bright light. That was countless sweet and wonderful inspirations flowing from the fresh soul. It was so appetizing, drooling. Please give me your charity, your excellency Huaishur. He spread his arms, laughed, and pounced forward. Save me from my predicament. The sacred hymn emerged from the pitch-black staff wrapped around his body. Accompanied by his movements, countless high-pitched hisses and tragic roars converged into a melody, playing the hymn of hell. He broke into Huaishur's melody so forcefully. It was as if he could hear the symphony praising the cold winter. He cut into the melody and interrupted Huaishur's rhythm, attacking step by step. Under the praiser's gray robe, countless piano keys appeared on his distorted body. They were controlled by invisible fingers and played the hymn of hell again. Wherever the pitch-black movement passed, countless faces appeared, wailing and singing miserably in the melody. The calamity of hell from the land of bliss condensed and took shape. Dozens of pitch-black claws emerged from under the gray robe like living creatures. They moved and retracted, changing constantly. The concrete walls and the solid ice that had been frozen for a long time were torn apart like thin paper. The building in front of him seemed to have become a toy in the hands of a child. But immediately after, the flames on the axe and the long sword smashed them one by one and cut them apart. Heaven and earth. From the fragmented melody, the grand chime sounded again. The frost wind roared and the symphony sounded again. In an instant, he crossed a long distance. The contemptuous face flashed in front of him. The spear whistled, and after tearing the pitch-black claws, it left a hole in his chest. Then, He closed his fingers and punched forward. Triple thunderbolt, collapse of the sky. In the loud roar, the praiser flew backward. The arms in front of his face burst into a mass of blood and quickly grew again. Then, the spreading stave was incinerated by the sword of virtue. What the hell? The praiser lost his voice. He couldn't understand. At this moment, under the restrictions of the environment, the strength of both sides could almost be said to be insignificant. What really determined the outcome was the attainments of the Calamity musicians, the control of melody and music theory of both sides. But why was he the one who was suppressed? For hundreds of years, he had played and composed without sleep. After becoming a Calamity musician, he had climbed and honed endlessly. He had even sacrificed everything to get to where he was today. In the end, his hymn of hell was suppressed by a junior who was less than a fraction of his age. He widened his eyes in disbelief. Boom! The scattered smoke and dust was torn apart, and the axe blade, wrapped in frost and flames, slashed down again. The chill and power from the entire frozen city was attached to it, and it easily broke through the praiser's defense, leaving a deep cut on his neck. Blood spurted out. He was almost beheaded in one blow. What made him even more uneasy was the sudden change in the melody and rhythm. Impossible! This is not classical music. The praiser roared and asked angrily, "What is this? Rock and roll. Haven't you heard of it?" Huaisher spread his hands and replied indifferently. "Who said that the cello can only be played in classical music? Times have changed, my friend. You have to rock and roll." "Crooked," the praiser roared. "Do you think you can beat me with such shallow things? This is just rock and roll. If you listen to heavy metal, won't your whole family explode with anger?" Huaisher shook his head. "Come on, my friend. Don't make excuses." The spear of compassion rushed forward and pierced through bit by bit. Under the influence of the flowing water, the hymn from hell was completely torn apart. The vicious poison spread in the wounds, and strange flowers grew from the hymn's body one after another. Under Huaisher's throw, the spear pierced through the praiser's body, pulled him backward, and nailed him to the collapsed wall. "If I were you, I would reflect on it." Huaisher raised his hand indifferently, wiped the blood off his face, and asked mockingly, "You can't beat others. Is it because, well, your professional level is not very good?" The praiser stiffened. "With this level of skill, why are you a disaster musician?" He spread his hands and sincerely suggested, "Why don't you consider changing your profession, saving the blessed land, and becoming an idol?" At that moment, the praiser's pupils almost shrank to the size of a needle tip. The pale face turned red, green, and black in unprecedented humiliation, and even twitched ferociously. It was hard to imagine that a person's facial features could be twisted into such an indescribable appearance. In the end, the pair of widened eyes actually exploded under the torment of the invisible flames of anger. Blood that was as thick as mud spurted out from it. What followed was a scream that caused the entire frozen city to tremble. Countless icicles shattered and fell. The walls and the ground trembled, and cracks appeared. The praiser's body swelled rapidly and was torn apart from the inside out. It was like an old robe being shed. A pair of hands stretched out from the cracked chest, followed by a naked body. A pair of glorious wings spread out from his back, and a solemn halo appeared above his head. It was as if an angel had descended to the mortal world. Under the power of Gaia's blood, he finally recovered his former state in the blessed land. In fact, it went one step further. Countless movements of the abyss wrapped around his body. Hatred, greed, desire, and all kinds of different meanings flowed out from them. He completely gave up the duel between the disaster musicians and the attainments of music that he was proud of. He wanted to use his strongest power to blast the damn guy in front of him into pieces. In the oncoming hurricane, Huaisher was already stunned. What the hell? Didn't we agree to compete on the same stage? Everyone was playing well, so why did you change your mind and flip the table? He was anxious, but the problem was, he seemed to be anxious too. "Ah, I feel it." The praiser raised his face and his 6 eyes stared at the opponent in front of him. A steady stream of inspiration is in your blood. Thanks to you, Mr. Huaishur, I finally understood. Then shouldn't you thank me properly? Huaishur took small steps back without leaving a trace and politely waved his hand. Forget about kowtowing and acknowledging me as your teacher. When there's a chance later, let's set up 2 tables and have some fun together. I will. The praiser raised his finger and grinned. After composing a new melody with your bones and blood, boom! The sound waves that were given substance suddenly burst out and formed dark claws without warning, grabbing a Huaishur's face. In an instant, Huaishur's raised axe blade was sent flying, and together with him, they smashed into the building that was riddled with holes. In the roar, Huaishur smashed through several walls in a row and fell into the presidential suite that was already covered in dust. 2 skeletons hugging each other fell from the sofa that was smashed by Huaishur, fell to the ground, and weathered into ashes. Sorry to disturb you. Huaishur got up in a sorry state. Before he could help collect the remains, he felt a low wind pressure above his head. The strange giant claw condensed again in the praising him. After tearing through layers of floors, it slammed down on Huaishur, not caring about the small wounds left by the spear, and smashed him into the floor. In the continuous collapse, Huaishur penetrated through layers of floors and fell into the banquet hall. In a moment of trance, he seemed to have fallen into an illusion once again. In the warm wind and incense, in the rearranged banquet hall, the people in ragged clothes shared the last of the food and wine. Everyone held hands in a simple performance, regardless of status. They danced happily, smiled, and sang in unison. There was no pain or sorrow. That was the scene before the destruction. But soon, the illusion disappeared again. Only the broken banquet hall was left. Dust fluttered and froze into frost. A pair of leather shoes stopped at Huaishur's feet. Have you thought it through, Mr. Huaishur? The store manager's illusion looked at the customer's sorry state and smiled awkwardly but politely. It seems that time waits for no one here. Yes, I've thought it through. Huaishur nodded frantically, but before he could finish, the giant claw condensed in the void picked him up again, clenched him tightly, and smashed him into the floor, falling into the messy hall. He raised a hand and rolled with all his might, avoiding the attack that was enough to completely crush him into meat paste. He panted in a sorry state. In the flying dust, the store manager's illusion reappeared and pointed at the elevator behind Huaishur. Huaishur turned around without thinking, ran with all his strength, smashed the broken iron door in front of him, and fell into the deep elevator shaft. Where are you going, Huaishur? The praising him smashed through layers of walls and laughed shrilly. The illusion can't save you. The huge, sharp claws appeared again, completely tearing the building in front of him apart. Everything was torn apart inch by inch and crushed into dust, leaving no opportunity for him to take advantage of. Together with those illusions, the store manager shrugged indifferently and watched Huaishur's disappearing back. He allowed his last remnant to be torn apart by the sharp claws and disappear. Only the rusted collar pin fell from the dissipating illusion. Amidst the fine sounds of collisions, the last glow appeared. It was the emblem from the Astronomy Society before the long, long destruction. When the world was destroyed, the earth fell apart, and everything was shrouded in endless cold. Only the last mission was transmitted in the eternal illusion, to send this remnant of the past to the hands of the future successor. At this moment, in the dark fall, the bright glow appeared in front of Huaishur again, bringing the gift from a long time ago. Huaishur, the departed soul, asked softly, "What do you want?" Huaishur reached out and held the beam of light tightly. At that moment, the last obstacle was torn apart by countless giant claws, and the ferocious face of the praising him appeared from behind the crack. Seeing the magnificent color of Gaia's blood, he froze for a moment, unable to hide his fear. But when the light dissipated, Huaishur only had a broken book in his hand. Other than that, there was no change. "What is that?" The praising him sneered. "Your savior? A broken book?" He waved his hand, and the music of the abyss played again. Dozens of giant claws appeared out of thin air and attacked without hesitation. At that moment, an illusory voice sounded in his ears. It was a soft chant from Huaishur. It was hoarse and low. "Look, my friend Sancho Panza, there are more than 30 extraordinarily large giants over there." As a result, the title of the book quietly appeared on the cover of the faded and mottled book in his hand. Don Quixote. At that moment, the ancient record of events quietly collapsed. Countless light spots flew out from it and condensed into the outline of a card. Like an angry dragon, the lightning shot up to the sky from the face of the card, whipping the heavens and the earth, sweeping away all the demons and monsters. The thunder spread and completely defeated the hymns and praises of hell. In the end, a skinny figure walked out of the void. Every time I open my eyes, I can see new trash under the entanglement of the lightning. The middle-aged man with long white hair looked back and asked coldly, "Kid, don't you have any respect for your seniors?" "Oh, look at what you're saying." Huaishur shrugged and blinked shyly. "Isn't it a good tradition of our celestial genealogy to call people over?" Dead silence. A long dead silence. Not only the praising hymn, but at that moment, all the participants who saw the endless lightning, the players outside the battlefield, and the bystanders in the Hell Palace, and the governing board fell into a sudden daze. In the dead silence, only the corners of Russell's mouth curled up into a happy smile. "Do you finally understand, Huaishur?" With Gaia's blood as the source, using the records in the Book of Destiny to reproduce and recreate, using the rules created by both sides in this bet, and thus crossing the limits of time and life and death, this is the golden finger that only belongs to you in this game. 70 years ago, the Utopia card set that resounded throughout hell. Thunder of the Four Seas, Ing Fangzhou. Chapter 11:15. Outside the chessboard. In the suffocating silence, everyone widened their eyes. Only the drowsy Marcus in the wheelchair raised his eyes, smiled slightly, and didn't say anything. But on the opposite side of the chessboard, Mathers, who stretched his head out in shock and wanted to lie on the chessboard to stretch his head into the battlefield, finally raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot. They were scarlet, as if he had just woken up from a nightmare. He clenched his fists so tightly that his nails almost tore his palms apart. He no longer had the grace and elegance from before. He roared in a hoarse voice, "Russell!" The roar that contained anger echoed in the palace. Even the youngest son of the Thunder Lord was stunned for a moment and subconsciously moved away a little, as if he had fallen into madness. Mathers waved his fists with all his might and cursed the person who didn't come here at all. Roars, shouts, and roars. He beat his chest and stamped his feet. Finally, he trembled and panted. His messy, mottled hair hung down from his forehead, making him look even more sinister and ferocious. After a long time, he finally calmed down. But even if his appearance returned to its original appearance, his eyes were still scarlet and didn't change. His murderous intent was ferocious. Not only him, but at this moment, the members of Golden Dawn far away in the land of dreams, the depths of hell, and the border battlefield fell into an uncontrollable rage. It originated from this arrogant provocation that was laughable but also ridiculing to the point of madness. It was as if they could see that old bastard holding a crutch and humming a song and tap dancing in front of them. He didn't stop spinning and jumping. Under the spotlight, he did a sitting split and then bounced up again. After a 360-degree turn, he raised the treasure in his arms with both hands. "Look, the Book of Destiny. The Book of Destiny is here. Hey, it's here with me. Not only do I have it, but I can also use it. You didn't expect it, did you, stinky brother? And I can even let others use it. Hey, come and hit me. I'm coming in, I'm going out. I'm coming in again. You can't hit me. Haha. After hiding it for so many years and tricking Golden Dawn into a mess for less than 3 months, he openly took it out to show off to everyone. He declared his ownership and even obtained the approval of the Book of Destiny. He had actually given the authority of the Book of Destiny, the holy artifact of the Utopia and the authoritative relic of the Book of Destiny, to such an unrestrained and arrogant young man to use as he pleased. Are you trying to anger me to death? Yes, he really wants to anger me to death. But I'm really angry. Even Jaeger, who was sitting in the internal meeting room of the command bureau, felt his throat tighten as he subconsciously glanced in Russell's direction. Did that old bastard really manage to obtain the Book of Destiny? If that was the case, wouldn't the guild leader election that he was promoting be ruined? The matter that was originally in the bag was now shaky. But the effects of the Book of Destiny were there. It couldn't be that this old bastard was trying to mislead them, right? A series of messy thoughts surged his mind. In the end, he subconsciously looked at the representative of the overhead floor beside him, Ms. X. How likely do you think this is? He asked. Ms. X was a woman who looked to be in her 40s. Her short hair was neatly combed, and she had a solemn appearance. She had always been meticulous. Hearing this, she thought for a moment and lowered her head to flip through the file in her hand. She shrugged slightly. Combined with Russell's usual behavior, there might be a 70% to 80% chance of this happening. However, when she thought of her old friend's history of high blood pressure and recent gastro problems, she couldn't help but sigh and comfort him. Look on the bright side. Maybe the Book of Destiny doesn't recognize Russell, but why sure? Thank you for your comfort. I feel much better now. After Jaeger finished speaking, he was silent for a long time. Suddenly, he felt his blood pressure rise. He suddenly remembered that when he was a secretary in the decision-making room, every time the Secretary General saw someone from the Utopia, he would have an unforgettable expression on his face. Is this the cycle of history? Isn't this a little too heavy? It wasn't just the other places that caused a commotion. Now, there was also a considerable commotion in the decision-making room. Seeing that Russell was secretly making a move, they couldn't help but look at him with admiration and shock. However, as the leaders of their respective lineages, everyone was used to seeing big scenes, so they didn't lose their composure. The news of Russell successfully controlling the Book of Destiny was indeed shocking. It was like the barbarians suddenly started building airplanes in the previous round. In this round, you learn the secret of the atomic bomb from a rural woman. However, these were all good things. Other than sighing with emotion that there was hope for the recovery of the Utopia, they also began to reconsider their future cooperation with the Ivory Tower. For a moment, the sound of congratulations was endless, and Luo Su's expression was as if it was a trivial matter, which made people feel sour in their hearts. Let him show off for a while. Who didn't celebrate the new year? Only Mystic Bird stared blankly at the battlefield on the chessboard. After a long time, he scratched his head and subconsciously pinched the painting scroll in his sleeve that contained all the blood contracts, records, and soul inheritances of the Eastern Xiao lineage. Can be done like this? The old man pinched his stubble, eager to give it a try. In any case, if he went downstairs and walked out of the door, he would be at the delivery point from yesterday. Should I give it a try? Huaisher gave it a try. Huaisher felt that it might work. And it worked. This was F***king off the mark. Originally, he just wanted to habitually shake someone, preferably someone familiar and powerful. However, he didn't expect that the moment he thought about it, the blood of Gaia would automatically flow into his body and activate the Book of Destiny. After combining it with the records left behind by Yingfang Zhou, it once again reproduced the records of his contract. Don Quixote. Then, relying on the rules of the Gaia fragment, it reappeared. It allowed the dead, who had already died, to combine the Sapphira and miraculous reappearance, almost reviving. Is this the heroic spirit summoning? I love it, I love it. Huaisher sighed softly and looked down at the back of his hand. It was a pity that he didn't have the 3 bars. An additional page suddenly appeared in his Book of Destiny, as well as Thunder of the 4 Seas. Yingfang Zhou reminded him that he hadn't changed locations and that everyone was still playing cards. Then what was this? Chain summoning? He didn't really understand card players like you, but it was right that the thigh had come. Then he noticed that the old man in front of him looked at him with disdain. Son, the whole family is very disappointed in you. After glancing at the praiser not far away, he casually sent him flying with a thunderbolt. Then he unhappily asked Huaisher It's been so long. Haven't you improved at all? Ahem, ahem. This is an urgent matter, an urgent matter. Huaishur awkwardly coughed twice, speechless. Although it was natural to call for an old senior to help them out when they encountered difficulties, it was a little inappropriate to call for the same old senior every time and dig the same grave in the same place. You can't keep taking advantage of him just because he's very strong and takes care of you. But we're familiar with each other, aren't we? Anyway, the person had been shaken and reinforcements had come from the sky. Then, wouldn't I win this round? Thinking of this, he lay down even more comfortably. I know the rules. Sit still and don't get in the way, right? Huaishur turned over, lying down and applauding. Old Senior Ing, kill him. In the dead silence, Ing Fangzhou's expression was cold. He looked at him, his eyes twitching, and suddenly reached out. Yun Zhongjuan's gravitational force pulled Huaishur up, lifted him, and swung him in a circle, aiming in the direction of the praiser. Go up. Throw. In an instant, there was a thunderous roar. Huaishur screamed in pain as she tumbled through the air. She had no power to resist as she spun 3,600 degrees with her tongue dangling out of her mouth. She landed face first in front of the praiser. Then, Ing Fangzhou raised his hand, and a thunderbolt spear descended from the sky. Electricity burst forth, surrounding him from all sides, turning into a deadly cage, sealing him both inside and outside. Finally, he casually summoned a gust of wind, blowing away the dust on the stone. He sat down and calmly ordered, "Settle your own problems." It wasn't just Huaishur. The praiser was dumbfounded. What was this? Everyone else was calling for heavenly soldiers and heavenly generals to save the day. But you were calling for your father? And you were cursing. And you were the only one who was cursing. Is there something wrong with your celestial genealogy's brain? But who the hell cares about that? I don't know who that old man who fell from the sky is. I can't beat him, but can I beat you? Under the pressure of the repeated insults, the praiser no longer hesitated. He began to play the abyssal chapter again. Countless viscous, poisonous origin substances formed into sharp claws that smashed down at Huaishur. Huaishur's face turned green. He scrambled to the side, desperately trying to dodge. This long-awaited tumbling and dodging allowed him to relive the taste of the earth. However, seeing the reinforcements he had called for become a judge in the blink of an eye was something he couldn't accept. You really don't care? Trapped between countless sharp blades, Huaishur pathetically turned around and shouted, "You should at least give me some pointers." Pointers? What pointers? Ing Fangzhou glanced at him and asked angrily, "You need pointers to beat up that kind of trash? Then what are you? Trash? Use your brain." Huaishur began to use his brain. Then, he discovered that using his brain was sometimes useless. It was better to rely on someone else. But since there was an old senior holding the fort in the gaze of death, he couldn't continue to embarrass himself. Unfortunately, he really couldn't beat him. Just dodging took up all of his strength. And this was only because the praiser was worried that Ing Fangzhou would suddenly launch a sneak attack and was on high alert. In the end, he was on guard against Ing Fangzhou, but he couldn't defend against Huaishur's endless stream of trash talk. Azan, let's talk things out. We're all artists. Wouldn't it be bad if we hurt each other? Under the siege of countless sharp claws and the bombardment formed by the movement, Huaishur was on the verge of collapse. He was in such a sorry state that it seemed like he would be blown to pieces in the next moment. But in the end, he only lost a few strands of hair. Other than being covered in dust from rolling around too much, there wasn't a single wound on him. Moreover, his mouth was constantly bulging like a machine gun, and it didn't stop at all. He was so excited that he flew up. I say, Azan, there's a saying that after all tribulations, as long as a brother is still around, we'll forget about enmity with a smile. We have no enmity between us, so it's not a threshold that can't be crossed. Wait, could it be that I accidentally chopped up your child? That can't be right? You can't blame me if he was eaten by the rancher. Your corporate culture has nothing to do with me. By the way, you're a writer, right? That's easy. What inspiration do you need? Just gather some notes, find a popular style, copy it, and pour some water into it. You'll be done in 2 hours, right? You know bolero, right? That piece can be played for half an hour over and over again. Even if your paradise has year-end performance and quarterly KPIs, or even monthly votes, you can't possibly have to update every day, right? 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 Every word, every phrase, every sentence was like a fly flying around the ears of the praiser, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. However, Huaishi's voice was full of energy, and he was a disaster musician. Even when he shouted, his voice still lingered in the air and wouldn't disperse. And outside the thunder prison, Ying Fangzhou's eyes kept looking over. Every time that sharp gaze swept over, he felt a chill all over his body. When he thought about how he had fallen into such a ridiculous situation because of his carelessness, the praiser could no longer bear the fury in his heart that almost wanted to swallow Huaishi whole. So annoying! He roared crazily, "Shut up!" on the body of the hunting angel. The music score of the holy poem was rapidly operating and expanding. In an instant, countless ferocious monsters flew out of the dark sea and pounced on Huaishi. But at that moment, he realized that Huaishi had already appeared 10 steps away from him. It was so sudden. No, when did it happen? But at that moment, on the straight path, there was no longer any obstruction. An opening. When the praiser subconsciously raised his arms and contracted his defense, he heard a soft chant that had already spread out in the wind. With all my soul, I dedicate myself to this sword. A dazzling brilliance rose from the sword blade and aimed at the face of the praiser. It also illuminated Huaishi's smile. The next part, he said, after directly skipping all the complicated steps in brewing, the glorious flow of light that had adeptly climbed to the level of divinity transformation gushed out in a casual manner. All the darkness was torn apart with irresistible force. It was as if the long night was wailing and dissipating under the impact of the blazing light. In an instant, it was as if he was thrown into a pool of sulfuric acid. Even though he did not dissolve on the spot under the impact that exceeded his expectations, the pain caused by the melting of his skin, evaporation of his flesh, and carbonization of his flesh made the praiser scream in fear. And at the moment when the blazing light extinguished, Huaishi was already within reach. After breaking through all the rigid monsters and sharp claws, the ever-changing weapon in his hand was aimed at the body of the praiser. The rhythm of the symphony overlapped in an instant. Triple chord. It was the long-awaited Xiang Dragon. After 3 crisscrossing cold lights flashed in an instant, the praiser was sent flying backward. Both of his arms and head fell off, leaving the lower half of his body on the spot. He was cut in half, but the miserable and resentful scream did not stop. Even though he was heavily injured by a supreme tear, such power was not enough to kill him. Amidst the exploding flesh, he was rapidly recovering and recovering. A pair of wings grew out from his back. Amidst the resentful scream, he looked up with his scarlet eyes. He glared at where Huaishi was, but he saw that behind Huaishi, outside the lightning prison, the old man who had been watching coldly finally stood up slowly. For the time being, it could be considered passable. Ying Fangzhou impatiently commented, although the martial arts of fists, legs, and weapons are overly flashy, they can still be considered pure. As for the rest, forget it. Watch carefully, Huaishi. He raised his hand and aimed it at the rapidly regenerating praiser. To deal with this kind of trash who likes to tangle with others, only one punch is enough. It was as if he was afraid that a foolish child would not understand. Every movement was deliberately slowed down. Every change and flow of origin substance was not held back. Threads of insignificant electricity wrapped around his 5 fingers. As he clenched his fist, yin and yang intensified. There were no hidden secret techniques, nor were there any unexpected ways to use them. He also did not ponder over any supreme tier playthings. He only used them as a matter of course, repeating the things that were on paper and the principles that everyone understood. 1,000 times, 10,000 times, 100,000 times, 1,000,000 times, until the thunder roared and the sky shook. The fine electricity flashed and disappeared, but it burst forth with a fierce light that burned Huaishi's eyes. The sky was like a drum, bursting forth with mighty echoes. The earth shook and wailed under the thunder, and right in front of Huaishi, the regenerating praiser was frozen in place. His eyes were wide open, staring at Fangzhou. It was as if he did not understand what had happened. In the deathly stillness, only the body rapidly disintegrated. Together with the soul that had descended on the chessboard, it turned into ashes and dissipated in the wind. In the end, the pair of lifeless eyes fell to the ground, still reflecting that fleeting and breathtaking light. The wind still carried the last gasp of the deceased. Wonderful. Chapter 11:16. Amazing. After a brief moment of dead silence, Huaisher seemed to have woken up from a dream. He clapped his hands frantically and applauded the senior's performance. It's not just amazing. It's simply amazing. It was as if he had experienced the difference between heaven and earth. It was an achievement that he would never be able to reach in his lifetime. Huaisher was so moved that he shook his head, intoxicated. It's really amazing, amazing my ass. Fangzhou interrupted his flattery and glanced at him from the corner of his eyes. He didn't know where this guy's face came from. What's so amazing about it? He asked. Huaishi's gaze drifted. This made Fangzhou even more unhappy. He didn't believe that Huaisher couldn't see it. For Yun Zhongjuan, this was an ordinary attack without any fancy moves. It could be said that it was no different from breathing instinctively. Yin and yang stimulated each other, and through the transformation of origin substance, it triggered the purest destruction and explosion. At the end of the day, ignoring all the changes in origin substance, it was just an electric shock. This kind of thing didn't even need Yin Zhongjuan to do it. In stormy weather, in power stations, cables, and even in every outlet, this kind of phenomenon happened all the time. Now, it was just using high-voltage electricity to electrocute someone to death. What was so amazing about it? However, anyone who had studied physics in junior high school would not find it strange. What was really important was the purity of it. It was just a punch without using any other abilities. Apart from the demonstration elements, there was no preparation or accumulation of power. It naturally buried the hunting angel from hell and thunder. Only ashes were left. If Huaisher used the same move, he could at most add a scorch mark to the opponent. His proficiency after thousands of practice sessions and his determination and tenacity to use strength to break through technique were the most important parts of this attack. It was also because of the painstaking effort he had put into it over such a long period of time that it was able to display an extraordinary effect. If it was in the past, Huaisher would definitely exclaim in surprise. However, after the Sword Saint's guidance, he was no longer as narrow-minded as before. Perhaps the effect seemed extraordinary, but for the person involved, it was a matter of course. It was just like drinking water and breathing. It could be done as long as one had hands and feet. In comparison, the other able-bodied people were like disabled people who could only look up to them with envy. This pure determination and willpower was what Fangzhou truly wanted to show Huaisher under the surface of the thunder. In the end, Huaisher, who clearly knew what was going on, started to change the topic and feign ignorance. It was only natural that the old senior would be unhappy. I don't understand what has become of the celestial genealogy. Fangzhou coldly reprimanded. All of you are crafty and only know how to scheme. If you can't win, you run away. If you can't run away, you call for help. What kind of master of the lineage are you? Cough, cough. Huaisher wanted to say something, but hesitated. Just as he was about to shift the blame and berate Russell for his heinous crimes, he saw Fangzhou suddenly wave his hand and interrupt him. Forget it. Don't say any more. Even if you say it, he's not here. No matter how angry you are, you can't beat him up. Do you think it's easier for you to beat me up just because I'm here? Huaisher's expression twitched, and he was speechless. After dealing with the praiser cleanly, Fangzhou waved his sleeves and directly raised a gust of wind, blowing away the dust in the ruins. An all-pervasive airflow swept through the ruins. Then, Huaisher saw a faint blue light. An electrostatic field had already spread out in the fine water vapor and snowflakes, enveloping the building. Finally, a crisp sound of metal colliding came from inside and jumped directly into Ying Fangzhou's hand. It was not an airflow lift or psychokinesis. It was just a random magnetization that attracted and pulled it over. This simple micromanipulation was something that Huaisher could not learn. This time, Ying Fangzhou did not reprimand Huaisher again. He just looked down at the thing in his palm. After a long time, he sighed softly. He threw it to Huaisher. Huaisher caught it in a hurry. He looked down and saw an emblem that looked like a brooch. On the black brooch was the emblem of a golden astronomical telescope and the symbol of a circling laurel representing the current state. After a long time, the colors still did not fade. Instead, after electrolysis, the dust and dirt on it had faded away, and it became as bright as new. Huaisher looked at it for a moment and was a little incredulous. It looks a bit like the emblem of the Astronomical Society. It doesn't look like it is, Ying Fangzhou replied. It was the emblem of the earliest days when the Pioneer Society led the establishment of the Astronomical Society with the support of the major lineages. At that time, they chose to establish it in the no-man's land of the 6 London Isles to show that there was no distinction between nationality and borders. The location was the Greenwich Observatory. The name that was announced to the public was the International Astronomical Society. The one in your hand is the emblem of the members when they were first established. Wow, Senior, you know so well. Huaisher flattered him at the right time, but he attracted the cold stare of the old man. Well, he kissed the horse's leg again. I don't know what the Astronomical Society is like now, but if you read the history of the Astronomical Society properly, this thing should be on the first page. Cough, cough. Isn't it because I'm busy with work? Huaisher sighed awkwardly. You see, I'm only 19 this year. Since my debut, I've been working as a human puppet. Things happen one after another. I want to make up for it, but I don't have the time. Ying Fangzhou still wanted to say something, but in the end, he didn't say anything. He just sighed. It was a rare look of melancholy, which was too weak for him. Why are the members of the First Astronomical Society here? Huaisher asked. Also, before I came here, I saw some illusions before Gaia broke. Wasn't it a part of the current state? Ying Fangzhou replied. It's not surprising that there are members of the Astronomical Society. There are also people like me who died in hell. Under the breeze, at the bottom of the building, under the debris of bricks and dust, the dim and mottled matrix appeared in front of Huaisher's eyes. Ying Fangzhou said, at that time, when the creation plan was decided, there were still many people who objected. But at this point, we had no choice. There was no precedent, no experience, and no one knew if it would succeed, so we could only prepare for the worst. Didn't we succeed in the end? Huaisher asked. Yes, but success isn't perfect. Ying Fangzhou said, there are still fragments that fall into hell, bringing along those who are guarding it. Huaisher fell silent. A long time ago, when everything collapsed and fell into hell, what kind of feelings did those who stayed behind look at the scene of rebirth in the distance gradually disappear? Among them, some were accidental negligence, and some were people who knew from the beginning that there was no way out. Apart from a utopia who directly participated in the reorganization and the continuation court as a backup measure, more than a quarter of the members of the directorate at that time sacrificed themselves to ensure the success of the creation plan. Ying Fangzhou sighed softly. Although that group of fellows are sometimes stubborn and annoying, their dedication and perseverance to their duties are in no way inferior to others. As he spoke, he stretched out his hand and touched the array that had long decayed and the secret apparatus that could no longer be maintained. The illusionary image of the hotel flashed for a moment and then disappeared. However, there was no one inside. It was empty, no longer as lively as Huaisher had witnessed. It was like a container that had lost the treasure inside. It was no longer valuable. Ying Fangzhou said, what you saw was his final alchemy. With this illusory dream as the foundation, The deceased hid the blood of Gaia in it and continued to this moment in the future, leaving it in the hands of the successor. This was the final sacrifice made by the nameless ancestor. If he used this power appropriately, he might be able to live a peaceful life in this hopeless situation, right? In any case, the Utopia had already abandoned him, and the Astronomy Association was destined to be unable to save him. In the future, perhaps no one would ever visit him again. However, he ultimately did not cross that boundary. Instead, he comforted the other victims and established the final camp to comfort and warm each other. He continued the short period of time and sacrificed himself to leave behind the thin illusion and dream that had lasted until now for them. In the end, he never abandoned his duty. Don't be fooled by the jokes of those bureaucrats in the directorate, why sure. Some people can become heroes and shine brightly. But don't forget that there are even more people who are sacrificing everything for the same dream and future. There has to be someone who is willing to take second place and hold on to an unimportant position for the rest of their lives. The Utopia is never nobler than other places. As members of the Astronomy Association, it's their existence that makes us what we are. Ing Fangzhou turned around and told him, "You have to remember this." "I will." Huaisha nodded. This time, Ing Fangzhou did not reprimand him anymore. He just took one last look at the ruins in front of him and walked out with Huaisha. Amidst the endless falling snow and cold winds, Ing Fangzhou raised his hand and temporarily parted the dark clouds, revealing the dark shadows that were constantly rising at the end of the distant sky. In the senses that Yun Zhongjuan transmitted to Huaisha's consciousness, he could sense the aura of the abyss that was constantly surging and transforming in the desolate world outside this frozen city. Calamities were constantly gathering. Under the control of the other participants and chess players, the power of hell gradually sprouted, grew stronger, and continued to extend. And in the area occupied by hell that was spreading like smoke signals, only a weak, helpless, and pitiful grade 2 mountain ghost hugged his golden thigh and trembled. Has everyone started to take pictures of the base and the mine? I'm afraid there's going to be an explosion of troops next. Huaisha pondered for a long time and tried his best to use tactful words to suggest, "It won't be safe here soon. We're alone, and there's no chance of winning if we fight them head-on. Do you think the two of us should change our strategy? If we run, then run. Why change our strategy? Who are you trying to fool?" Ing Fangzhou glanced at him as if he could read his mind. "Why? In your eyes, am I an old antique who can't understand the situation?" This, Huaisha was stunned. "You've already said it yourself, so you can't blame me for this." Chapter 11:17. Huaisha had originally been worried that Ing Fangzhou would immediately go berserk upon seeing the forces of hell and the abyss. He would ignore everything and kick Huaisha into his pocket, killing him and showing off his peerless elegance. In the end, he would wait for the withered king's heart to tremble and give the order to stop shooting arrows. Then, he would kill his way back to the ivory tower and throw Huaisha to that old bastard Russell. But now, it seemed that things were not as bad as he had feared. Although he did not hide his hatred for hell, he still retained some rationality and even seemed to be more reasonable than before. Then, Huaisha asked, "Shall we leave?" "What else?" Ing Fangzhou asked in return. "It doesn't matter if we stay. Do you expect a dead person like me to command you?" "Ahem, then let's go." Huaisha slapped his thigh, prepared to retreat immediately. After spending a short time together and combining his previous experience, Huaisha had a rough idea of Ing Fangzhou's temper. He had already written down a new way of getting along with him in the Book of Destiny. Simply put, it was to smooth things over. Flattery and praise were useless. He hated being considerate and weak the most. No matter how much one accommodated him, if one could not show their own value, he would not praise or acknowledge them. On the contrary, what he liked the most was being unafraid of authority and not being confused or hesitant to make decisions, even if the authority was being looked down upon and the person being criticized was himself. Although he had many complaints about Huaisha using him as a tool, He would at most give him a cold scolding when his junior was being unreasonable. As long as he showed the ability and responsibility to fulfill his duties, he would not be stingy with his support. So, as long as he stood up and showed his value and did not think that he could win by relying on others, the senior would not roll his eyes. Then, there was no time to lose. Since he had decided to run now, he had to figure out the specific location and the surrounding situation first. "Mr. Isaac, can I trouble you to give me a map?" Huaisha looked up and shouted. Although he did not know how to communicate with the outside world, he could at least ask first. Outside the chessboard, the vice principal was silent. He calmly waited for his turn. His hand was still pressed on the card box. Under the cover of his long sleeves, it seemed to flicker for a moment. Very quickly, it returned to its original state and threw a card into the field. Abyss Mirror. At this moment, within the massive fragment of Gaia, a massive launcher appeared out of thin air above the turbulent land. Immediately following that, flames and intense light spewed out from under the rocket. The huge steel ship rose into the sky, and after a few minutes, it left behind the burnt wreckage and flew into the depths of the sky. Within the chaotic and dark void, the steel object that had been shrunk within the box began to expand, and the 6 origin form feedback plates unfurled like metal wings. Overlooking everything from the highest point, the entire fragment of Gaia was within his observation range. Unfortunately, a scarlet beam of light crossed thousands of miles and burned the satellite into scrap metal. On the ground, surrounded by countless guards, an eye on the highest tower of the Devil Palace slowly closed. Thousands of giant feet continued to trample on the ground as they slowly walked toward the battlefield in the distance. However, before it was destroyed, the mirror had already sent all the information and records back to the data center. Next to Isaac, the American gambler threw out a spell card, Light Messenger Eagle, at the right time. Soon, the map recorded on the parchment flew in all directions under the stream of light. The information from the celestial genealogy was sent to the hands of every participant, including Huaisha. It also very considerately marked the location of Huaisha and the others, as well as the surrounding layers of the abyss. Huaisha's vision turned dark. Have I been thrown into a den of thieves? The originally pale map had been dyed with various colors for various forces. Of course, in this battle that had just begun, everyone still occupied their own strategic points and resources and had not had time to develop. And under the fierce attacks of various lineages, the situation in the present realm seemed to be quite good, vaguely encompassing 60% of the territory. The territory inside the fragment of Gaia was also frighteningly large. Just the range of the land alone exceeded 1/3 of the land of Doomsday, especially with the existence of lakes, rivers, oceans, and island around it. And now, separated by the scattered battle zones between the two sides, the present realm was on the other side. Hell was on the other side, and he was on the other side. What did it mean to be alone behind the enemy? Outside Frozen City, if one walked to the left for a day, they would reach the storm altar knocked down by the Sea of Thunder. If one walked to the right for a little more than half a day, they would reach the blood-stained land of the fallen nation. Behind them was the factory of the Eternal Group. Not far away, apart from the meeting place of Dark Eye, was the beacon left behind by the Golden Dawn. There are even 4 beacons, completely covering most of the surrounding area, monitoring all of Huaisha's movements. How did he get surrounded before it even began? If it weren't for Ying Fangzhou's deterrence, ordinary cannon fodder would not have been effective. Someone might have directly thrown a card over and smashed the cannon tower into Huaisha's face. How could he not run? Run. He had to run, and he had to run quickly. But isn't this road a little too far? Huaisha stared blankly at the position of the closest ally on the map, the Great Pyramid built by the American lineage. They had to cross at least 1/3 of the fragment in between. Moreover, there were many marked abnormal and catastrophic areas, as well as areas occupied by Hell. This did not include the interference from Hell during their journey. If it weren't for the golden thigh beside him, Huaisha would have just sat there and waited for the card to be torn. What the F***CK? Isn't it good? Ing Fangzhou lowered his head to look at the map and said slowly, "If we have time on the way, we can properly educate this outrageous intern." As he spoke, he directly took the map in Huaishi's hand and erased all the crooked retreat routes that Huaishi had drawn. Then, he drew a brand new route from here to the deep transit base that had just been set up by the vice principal. It was a straight line without any twists and turns. It was straight. They crossed mountains, lakes, and rivers, and then passed through the 6 areas occupied by Hell and the crossfire between the 2 sides. They moved forward without hesitation, completely leaving the obstruction and pursuit of Hell behind. No, it should be said that they did not take them seriously at all. What? Huaishi was stunned. What's the point of hiding? Ing Fangzhou said, just fight your way out. Huaishi was speechless. That's not right. Soon, Ing Fangzhou seemed to have thought of something. He picked up the map again, erased his route, and said in agreement, "Your worries are not unreasonable." Phew, that's right. Huaishi wiped his cold sweat and nodded. Before he could say anything else, he saw a brand new retreat route. They no longer had their original arrogant appearance, but became even more arrogant. After abandoning the straight line, dozens of sharp turning routes appeared on the map. After involving more than half of Hell's territory, they formed a marching route that made Huaishi's vision turn black. Aren't you looking for Gaia's blood? Ing Fangzhou patted the map. Since we're leaving, let's take everything we can. It'll save us from making a wasted trip later. Oh my God, are we retreating? Huaishi held the map and looked at the targets marked on it. His hands began to tremble. How was this escaping? They would take everything they could, kill everything they could, and kill everything they could. They were just short of running directly to the enemy's base camp. It was obvious that it was not going to end well. However, when he saw the kind eyes from the old senior, Huaishi was suddenly not afraid of anything. Well, this is probably the way the Utopia retreats. Sure enough, it's full of ideals. The only problem is that there's only one problem left. Huaishi spread his hands. This road is almost thousands of miles away. We can't possibly walk there on 2 legs, right? Or is it that you're tired and have to take me to the skies? If I could still fly freely, there would be no need to retreat at all. Ing Fangzhou raised his hand and summoned a gust of wind. The biting cold caused Huaishi to shiver. However, the gust quickly dissipated without a trace. It was faster than Huaishi had expected. It was as if this world is resisting Yun Zhongjuan's operation. No, it should be resisting humans themselves, right? Every place is full of hostility toward us, Huaishi. Ing Fangzhou's expression was gloomy. It has fallen to such a state. Just the smell of corruption makes me want to vomit. Under the resistance of the Gaia fragment, Yun Zhongjuan's power could not act according to the situation. He could only forcefully seize the celestial phenomenon from the fragment's control. This operation was not without effect, but it was as if he was constantly pulling a rope to wrestle with the world. It was half the result with twice the effort, and the gains did not make up for the losses. Then what should we do? Huaishi asked. There are many ways. There are so many vehicles in this city. Don't you know how to use them? Ing Fangzhou casually pointed. The street not far away was filled with the wreckage of cars and various vehicles. Huaishi was dumbfounded. Can it still be used after being left here for so long? If it can't be used, then fix it. Bring me a wrench. Ing Fangzhou rolled up his sleeves and walked forward. He began to skillfully dismantle the car in front of him. By the time Huaishi found the toolbox in a pile of trash, the car had been completely dismantled. He was so skilled in dismantling and repairing that even Huaishi, who was passing the tools beside him, could not keep up with his speed. He was even despised. So, young people nowadays are too spoiled. They don't even know how to repair cars. Ahem, senior. Huaishi's expression twitched. I play the cello. Oh, then you and Mu Jing must have something in common. Ing Fangzhou did not stop moving. He casually said, in addition to the Ascendant, there are 6 certificates of disaster musicians: violin, piano, clarinet, eru, dongshaguqin, and opera. He paused for a moment and raised his eyes to look at Huaishi. He was serious. Also, he knows how to repair cars. Huaishi's eyes were filled with tears. He was speechless. Then, He felt a pair of gloves in his hand. "Put on," Ing Fangzhou said without raising his head. "I'll teach you." Huaishir was stunned for a long time before he finally reacted. He hurriedly nodded and went over to take it. "Look carefully. This is the flywheel. It's broken. I have to remove it completely. Be careful when you do it. Don't break the power distribution. Forget it. If you break it, you can remove the other cars. I'll teach you the specific structure first. Put your hand down. Don't touch the clutch that I just removed." 2 hours later, the car repair class finally ended. After removing most of the vehicles on the street, a monster-like motorcycle under the twisting of the accelerator burst out with a soul-shaking roar. Thick smoke billowed. After the heavenly fault was attached, the source substance replaced the fuel and integrated into the transmission structure of the entire motorcycle in an extremely delicate and compatible way. After Huaishir temporarily strengthened the metal material with various methods, the stability and durability had reached a new level. At this moment, under Ing Fangzhou's control, the motorcycle roared and broke through the frozen ice and frost. Facing the flying snow and cold wind, it headed toward the wilderness outside the city. On the weather-beaten face, there was bravery and determination that was not afraid of difficulties. Mottled white hair flew in the wind, an imposing appearance. As for the Paradise Prince in the trailer next to it, who was wearing a pink safety helmet and squatting on a chair, that was another matter. In the end, Huaishir spat out the snow that flew into his mouth and decided to struggle a little more. Amidst the roar, he raised his voice and asked, "I say, Senior, isn't our route of retreat a little too arrogant?" "Is it?" Ing Fangzhou asked. "Of course it is." Huaishir was helpless. "Then it is." Ing Fangzhou twisted the accelerator and increased the speed, not caring about the danger that followed. "If you can do it, then do it. As long as you can do it, then it will be effective." After saying this, he turned around and glanced at the junior in the trailer. "Huaishir, I believe in you. I never thought you were a waste or trash," Ing Fangzhou said seriously. "You're just lazy." Huaishir was stunned. "Don't worry." For the first time, Huaishir saw such a happy smile on Ing Fangzhou's face. He was full of expectations. "Waste and trash can't be trained, but I have ways to deal with lazy people." After more than 70 years, Huaishir finally experienced the trauma of Sharma. But it was too late. The motorcycle rolled away, and his tears had disappeared in the wind. Now it seems that everyone is almost ready. Outside the chessboard, Mathers stared coldly at the traces of Huaishir and the others leaving. His eyes were cold, and there was no longer a pretentious smile and gentleness. "Look, the children who don't know the immensity of heaven and earth and the stubborn old man who has been dead for many years have started to travel happily in the apocalypse. It's really admirable. It can only be said that things like self-righteous and unrepentant are completely beyond redemption. After seeing too much of it, there is no way to arouse the slightest interest." He paused, raised his eyes, and looked at the other side of the chessboard. But he didn't look at Isaac. His gaze fell on the old man in the wheelchair. "Of all the people, Marcus, I've always believed that you understand us." The emissary from Golden Dawn asked coldly, "Whether there was friendship or recognition, you should know how ridiculous the choice you made was. But even so, if I tell you this now, you won't be swayed, right?" The old man in the wheelchair didn't speak. He just looked down. He stared blankly at the projection of the fragment, at the figures of the old man and the young man who disappeared in the wind and snow. He smiled, just like a child. After a long time, Mathers withdrew his gaze in disappointment. If that's the case, then there is nothing to look forward to. In his hand, the card that was flipping unsteadily finally revealed its original appearance. A completely blank card. At this moment, in Mather's hand, the record of events slowly gathered, and the phantom of a tower appeared on the surface of the card. A bright golden frame surrounded it, and in front of the phantom of the tower, a vague outline of a human figure slowly emerged. At that moment, all the chess players in the Discovery realm looked up in shock, only to see a never-before-seen card was forged in his hand. "Don't forget, event creation is not unique to the Discovery realm," Mathers announced coldly. Get ready. This is a surprise specially prepared for you. At that moment, the final title appeared on the card. The chosen one, Alistair, 16. Chapter 11:18. The moment the card was casually tossed out, the soul from hell quietly descended into the fragment. Above the wilderness filled with beacons and towers, layers of flowing light converged, casting a brand new body. Pale hair fluttered in the wind. A slightly thin man stepped barefoot on the ground. His face was handsome, without the wind and frost of age. His eyebrows were like those of a teenager. Other than the black robe on his body, there were no other cumbersome accessories. However, under his guidance, boundless radiance surged between the 16 beacons from the Golden Dawn and the 6 towers created by Calamity. They intertwined with each other, forming an ancient and vicissitude city. Just like this, after the Eternal World Group and the Eye of the Abyss, Golden Dawn finally descended on their own base. After a long period of preparation, it formed a projection from the Land of Dreams, a place that stood alone from the world. Even though it was in hell where disasters were surging, the huge city was still like a lotus flower that grew out of the mud without being tainted. However, every time the aura surging within leaked out from the city gate, even the disasters from the abyss would start to move away and not approach. The solemn palace that resembled a sanctum was just another demon's den created with the essence of the abyss. Under Alistair's control, the entire city seemed to have come alive as if it had life and soul. It was as if the two were originally one. At this moment, when Alistair raised his hand, a mighty bell burst forth from the tower that rose from the ground in the center of the city. Pale waves spread under the city, spreading out, and finally outlined a huge square outline. Wherever it passed, everything seemed to have lost their color, forever solidifying into a plaster-like sculpture. The ground was flat and pale, like a piece of white paper. Accompanied by the sunlight, when the shadow of the forgotten city was cast on it, it flowed like viscous ink. Countless tiny runes appeared on the ground and quickly disappeared. Only at the edge of the pale white color was a layer of paper sheet-like faults. The enormous forgotten city was like a three-dimensional paper sculpture built on top of a huge book, revealing a strange sense of beauty from the indescribable exquisiteness. In Alistair's hand, a book with the same outline appeared. He closed it, and the name of the book appeared on the spotless cover. Book of Law and Aura, similar to that of the Book of Destiny, lingered on it, causing Isaac's expression to change. He clenched his fists in anger, and his expression darkened. After so many years, the group of lunatics from the Golden Dawn still didn't stop their footsteps. On one hand, he was frantically searching for traces of the Book of Destiny. On the other hand, he was also making preparations. The reproduction of authority. They, who had mastered the structure of the former kingdom of heaven, searched for miracles and disasters in hell, and finally created a carrier that could record everything. Even though it couldn't be compared to the Book of Destiny, and it didn't have the cultivation accumulated by the members of the Astronomical Society, it was still enough to display some of the effects of the original version. Just like what Huaisher did just now. Thou art the outline of the law. As Alistair chanted, the pages of the Book of Law flipped once more. The bell in the tower above the city rang once more. Amidst the deep and majestic sound, countless ink stains appeared out of thin air in front of Alistair and rapidly reassembled. It evolved into a record of what happened in the past. When the skinny figure of the heretic king appeared in front of Alistair, the light of Gaia's blood flew out from the monk's open palm. It fell into it. It once again gave a soul to a dead object to record. Under the dissipating ink marks, a pair of eyes filled with chaos and darkness looked up again. The black-haired, black-eyed, naked middle-aged man staggered forward like a newborn baby. After falling down, he stood up again. He opened his mouth and violently vomited, but nothing came out. He only made hoarse sounds like roars and shouts. In the end, he finally calmed down. He looked at the world in front of him and read the information that appeared in his soul, and the corner of his mouth curled up into a happy smile. Oh, I've returned to sobriety from madness. The world is so beautiful. He said, "Long time no see, Alistair." "Long time no see, Mr. Woodman." Alistair greeted him. "It seems that the rules here have indeed temporarily awakened you from the sea of chaos formed after your soul shattered. It's best not to have any expectations. For my current state of neither life nor death, it's just an intermission between two periods of madness and despair. If it could be of any use, just tell me." Woodman raised his hand and snapped his fingers. A Roman robe covered his body and a laurel crown on his head. He once again showed his posture and appearance from 70 years ago. When he looked back, his eyes gradually became ferocious. "There's a familiar smell in the wind," he said softly. "I smell Russell's smell and the little brat they raise, and Ingfangzhou. He's alive too? Or is he like me? Well, your old friends have been waiting for a long time. I'm afraid there will be more coming, right?" Alistair shrugged. "This world is really strange. There are actually people who have the same thoughts and plans as us. It's really hard to predict. Could it be that this is the so-called old enemy? Old enemies? Our war ended 70 years ago. What's left is just a group of lonely ghosts waiting to be forgotten." Woodman sneered, "But the reunion after 70 years is really something to look forward to." Alistair pondered for a moment and sighed softly. "I wasn't born 70 years ago. Although I read some records, I never experienced it myself. Now it seems that there's no room for me to interfere with the old grudges between the old and the new. Don't worry about it, and don't test me, Alistair. I've never liked you, and I've never hidden it." Woodman replied, "But since Mathers left you here, you naturally have to be the leader. If you have any orders, you don't have to be polite. Then, since that's the case, let's determine our course of action." In Alistair's hand, the Book of Law once again moved without any wind, and the portrait of a young man appeared on the page. "Why, sure." Woodman frowned. "Yes, the situation is constantly changing. To be honest, I don't have the slightest certainty about what will happen next. After all, the entire present realm is our opponent, so it's not surprising if something happens. In contrast, I'm more concerned about this successor of celestial genealogy. After going through his resume and records, I feel that compared to the many hidden schemes of the present realm, perhaps this is the opponent we have to eliminate if we want to win." Alistair said indifferently, "This is the most fatal variable. Russell entrusted victory and defeat to him, and it seems that every time he lived up to expectations. No matter what kind of predicament he faced, he was always able to complete the task with the most efficient method. This time, it might be the same as before." He paused for a moment and looked at his teammate meaningfully. "Mr. Woodman, I think you should have experienced this yourself." Alistair. Woodman stared at the young man in front of him. After a long time, he suddenly smiled. "You know, I'm starting to like you." "Then it's decided?" Alistair asked. "As you wish." Woodman nodded. Both sides reached an agreement. In this gamble, all the complicated games and considerations were temporarily set aside. Before the situation became clear, they had to do their best and leave no room for maneuver. Targeting Huaishur, they could lose the team battle, but that old bastard Russell and the little bastard he raised must die. "I feel like I'm being targeted." In a harsh roar, Huaishur turned around and looked at the old man leaning on a motorcycle behind him and added, "And I'm being targeted very badly. If you have something to say it quickly." Ingfangzhou glanced at him indifferently and urged, "If you don't dare to go, just say it. Why are you talking so much nonsense? Is this because I don't dare to go?" Huaishur was enraged. She jumped up and pointed at the crown wearer inside the lightning prison. "I'm only at the second level. Senior, you want me to beat up the crown wearer? This is more like asking me to send him to hell." "Don't worry. When necessary, I will take action." Ingfangzhou crossed his arms and said indifferently, "Don't worry about getting hurt." As Yin Zhongjuan, although I'm not good at first aid, at least there won't be a problem with CPR. It was CPR. How could there be no problem? Huaishur felt that he was crying in his heart, and it was tears of blood. When others shook people, they would shake a good brother from the sky to save the situation. Moreover, There were big sisters with big breasts and long legs. Each one of them was hardworking, and gentle. Why was it different when it came to him? What did he shake? Father. He had only been out for less than 4 or 5 hours, but he had already realized that being Ying Fangzhou's companion really required some psychological quality. At least the ability to withstand pressure had to be good. Mr. Sharma, I've misunderstood you. You've already done very well. When he thought of how that kind of extreme autism was tortured by Ying Fangzhou, Huaishir couldn't help but want to call for an express delivery and send the reinforcements he had shaken to the iron crystal seat. Maybe the great Grandmaster's depression would be cured in a few days. But now, it was useless no matter how much he cursed in his heart. After the old man led Huaishir all the way into the sanctuary of the blessed land, he was ruthless and merciless. He didn't even say a word and evaporated a large group of people into ashes like cutting melons and vegetables, leaving only a crazy old monster for him. He even called it training. The difficulty of his training was probably even higher than that of the Spartans, right? What do you want me to use to fight? Huaishir was stunned. Don't just think about being lazy, Huaishir. It's just a crown wearer. Why just advance to rank 2? I was already killing them for fun. Can't you even do such a small thing? As he spoke, Ying Fangzhou reached out and grabbed Huaishir's collar with an invisible force. He threw him hard, ignoring Huaishir's struggle, and stuffed him directly into the cage. I don't know how perfunctory the person who taught you was, but your supreme shouldn't be so simple. He looked up and said solemnly, "Let me see where your limit is." At that moment, Huaishir didn't have time to speak. He only heard the angry roar in the wind again. In the cage, the crown wearer roared, and the iron hammer stained with sticky blood was aimed at his head. It smashed down with a bang. Chapter 11:19. In a hurry, Huaishir did not have enough time to react. She subconsciously leaned back and fell onto the ground, narrowly avoiding the tragic fate of having her head smashed into pieces. Then, he felt a strong wind blow into his crotch. Only then did he realize that the hammer had smashed into the ground between his legs. He had almost hit a car and almost lost his family and friends. He wanted to call a timeout, but the crown wearer, who had entered a bloodthirsty frenzy, didn't give Huaishir any chance to do so. Go to hell, Earthling! The 4 arms of the man with the crown, which was as fat as a mountain of flesh, held a strange bone-chopping knife, a pitch-black iron pot, a giant shovel, a rolling pin like hammer, and other weapons that made the infernal cooking demon feel a sense of familiarity. The giant mouth in front of his chest roared, "I'm going to dip you in paste and roast you into a Wellington steak as a snack." "Don't, brother." Huaishir dodged pathetically. In a state of overdrive, your step speed was very fast. "My meat doesn't have any fat at all. It's too dry. You can't get any oil from roasting it. You might as well make soup." "Soup? This little meat can't even be considered a seasoning. And you want to make soup?" The man wearing the meaty crown grinned maliciously, and the dozen or so large eyeballs on his face swiveled around, locking on a Huaishir's dodging trajectory. He raised his 4 arms, and the bone-cleaving giant saber and the rolling pin came crashing down one after another, surrounding her from both sides. The iron pot suddenly flipped over, and a huge amount of thick and fragrant meat juice gushed out. Everywhere it passed, it was like lava, burning iron, and stone red. Half of Huaishir's waist-length hair was burned off, making him look very miserable. But in this short gap, Huaishir rushed forward, stepping on the giant shovel and suddenly leaping into the air. The axe of wrath in his hand was aimed at the crown wearer's head and chopped down. Blood spurted out, and a scream burst forth. Under the support of Supreme, the blade of the axe, which gathered the echo of the earth, cut off the crown wearer's head like a hot knife through butter. The impact of the origin substance from wrath caused the crown wearer's chest to let out a shrill scream. Ignoring the gushing blood, he swung the rolling pin horizontally and smashed Huaishir away as if he was swatting a fly. Huaishir only felt numbness in his hands. He could barely hold his weapon. A gap appeared in the sword of virtue in front of his chest. Right in front of him, the headless man picked up the iron pot and poured the contents into the giant mouth. As the broth flowed down, a bloody head regrew from the wound. "You can do that?" Huaishir was dumbfounded. "Are you stupid? Grandpa is the cooking demon." The man with the crown let out a ferocious roar. He raised the pot with both hands and smashed it down. A large amount of meat juice spurted out from the pot again, along with all kinds of strange, worm-like parasites and broken limbs that came out of nowhere. They were like cannonballs, constantly smashing towards Huaishir. Bone Mountain House pickpocket, head chef. "Don't be like that. I'm also a cooking demon, one of us. We're all cooking demons. Cooking demons don't fight cooking demons." Huaishir retreated step by step, pathetically chopping or pushing away the worms and broken limbs that flew towards him. "We're in the same line, brother. We're in the same line." But for some reason, after coming here, he seemed to always run into people in the same line. But why do people in the same line always look forward to their deaths? Is this hell? Huaishir was about to cry. "Huh? Do I need you to King tell me? I know by smelling it." The head chef laughed sinisterly. "An ingredient like you is really too hard to find." From the giant mouth, thick saliva was secreted, landing on the ground and making a sizzling sound. "No matter what, you have to King die this year." The head chef shouted and rushed over again. "Even if I'm killed by that old thing, I'll roast you first." As he said that, the giant bone-chopping knife and the iron pot slammed together, and a large amount of sparks flew out from it. In the Thunder Prison, the temperature suddenly rose. This was especially true for the ground beneath his feet. Under the spray of sparks, the temperature was rapidly rising. Just by stepping on the ground, one could feel the rapidly surging heat. It was as if he had suddenly arrived on a metal plate that was roasting meat. Large amounts of oil spurted out from the iron pot, causing a strange fragrance to spread through the air. Black pepper, basil leaves, and even pickled sauce were continuously sprinkled down. This strange temptation caused Huaishir's gaze to grow hazy, and he was almost split in half by the giant blade. His scalp went numb. His stamina and origin substance were rapidly depleting. If it weren't for the flower bracelet on his wrist, he probably would have collapsed or been seriously injured. "How the CK am I supposed to fight like this?" Huaishir was enraged. He turned around and yelled at Fangzhou, who was outside the Thunder Prison. "What's the point of just tormenting me like this? What exactly are you trying to train me for?" "Of course it's to see what kind of fancy tricks you grasped, Huaishir. I want to see how you squander this precious talent and strength of yours. You're sitting on a mountain of treasures, but you don't even know it." Fangzhou calmly replied, "Very good. I can feel your effort and anger, Huaishir. You started to get serious." "What's the point of being serious?" Huaishir angrily countered. He flicked the rolling pin into the air, and the spear of compassion in his hand stabbed forward. A vast, mournful hum sounded out as he stepped forward. The layers of rhythmic vibrations converged into one, and along with the tip of the spear, the head chef's bloated body exploded. In an instant, a large hole had appeared, as if he had been struck by a giant cannon. However, the head chef didn't seem to feel any pain at all. He laughed savagely as he reached out and grabbed Huaishir by the neck. After lifting him up, he slammed him into the ground. With a loud bang, the shadow of the raised rolling pin and the iron pot enveloped Huaishir's face. Smash! In that instant, all distracting thoughts disappeared from Su Chen's mind. All that was left was escape. The moment Huaishir came to his senses, he felt the howling hurricane behind him and the loud sound of the iron pot and the rolling pin hitting the ground. He actually retreated dozens of meters away with one step. It was like thunder. No, it was thunder. At this moment, on his hands, feet, and body, wisps of electric light kept rising, stimulating his body. He didn't hesitate to destroy his muscles and cells to stimulate all his hidden strength. Just now, it was this sudden electric light that made Huaishir's movement speed increase again, and he avoided the fatal blow. It was the protection of Yin Zhongjuan. When Huaishir looked back at Fangzhou, he saw the old man's indifferent look. He just waved his hand and motioned for him to continue. He could only continue. When he looked at the furious head chef in front of him again, Huaisher felt more confident. He clenched the sword and axe in his hands and faced the head chef head-on. Then he felt a sudden stabbing pain. Achilles tendon, trapezius, semitendinosus, his calves, shoulders, arms, and fingers felt like needles were pricking him. The pain caused by the electric light was sharp. As Huaisher's movements changed, the stabbing pain began to move. However, every place was an important joint and point of force, causing Huaisher's movements to suddenly change. He was almost smashed in a meat paste by the iron pot again. What the hell? Was this still a debuff? But when he ran, the stabbing pain strangely disappeared without a trace. He couldn't understand it at all. Was it to let him wander around and fight without facing the opponent head-on? But the moment such a thought appeared in his mind, there was a sudden stabbing pain in his Achilles tendon and calves, causing him to stagger and stop abruptly on the spot, panting violently. It seemed that he understood a little. Purify, purify, purify. Why don't you understand? Ing Fangzhou's angry rebuke came from outside the Thunder Prison. Why sure? How many times do you want me to say it? Why do you need so many messy tricks to deal with the enemy? He said, one hit is enough. Then I have to have basic skills like yours. Huaisher retorted angrily. That's not realistic at all. Why is it not realistic? Ing Fangzhou asked coldly. Also, who said that? Your basic skills are not enough now. At that moment, Huaisher was stunned. He forgot the burning pain in his feet and was almost cut in half by the giant bone-chopping knife. But in the fog that suddenly appeared in his mind, he seemed to have grasped something again. When he dodged and counterattacked again, the stabbing pain kept appearing all over his body like a ghost. This time, he finally realized the source of the stabbing pain. It was not Ing Fangzhou's whip. It was the side effect of Yun Zhongjuan's blessing, a deliberate side effect. Through the stimulation and overload of the electric current on the muscles, Huaisher revealed the hidden dangers that he had not noticed. At every moment, it was constantly changing. Thanks to the deep integration of the sublimator's body and soul, the time consumed by the transmission of nerve signals was completely negligible. And when the tactics and decisions emerged from the soul, Huaisher's body naturally made preparations and responses. Piercing? Slashing? Retreating? Attacking? Exchanging injury for injury? Or should he attack and wait for a good opportunity? When countless responses emerged in his mind, it brought more options. And the use of the muscles involved included the calf muscles, the upper arm, the forearm, the spine, the 10 fingers, and the feet. In a short span of time, at least 4 or 5 different plans appeared on his body, guiding every part of his body to make preparations. However, the requirements of each plan were completely different, causing them to conflict with each other. None of them were able to do their best, and each of their movements restrained each other in places that he could not detect. If Elder Luo were here, he would definitely laugh at Huaisher's slow comprehension. The messy techniques and responses would only dazzle you. There were countless techniques and a list of supreme that could fill up to 7 to 8 pages on an A4 paper. But in the end, that was just a backup plan. 10 ways to deal with it was already too many. As for the real solution, only one was enough. Only after discarding all distracting thoughts and focusing on a pure attack could the real effect of the power be unleashed. When he suddenly realized this flaw, Huaisher's mind flashed a subtle understanding. He could not help but smile, and then he realized it was completely useless. The stinging pain appeared on his body again, even more intense than before, causing him to dodge awkwardly. "What are you doing, Huaisher?" Ing Fangzhou questioned angrily. It was as if the master had already led the disciple through the door, but the annoying disciple began to repeatedly jump in front of the door. He understood, but not completely. He went in, but not completely. His graceful movements made his blood pressure soar, and he could not suppress his evil desire to hit someone. "I can't do it," Huaisher cried. Chapter 11:20. At this moment, Huaisher's tears almost flowed out of his eyes in grief and indignation. He dodged the onslaught awkwardly and twitched from time to time because of the stinging pain. Everyone understood the principle, but how many people could do it? Why was the pigeon so big? Who knew? His mind liked to indulge in flights of fancy. So how could he possibly have a pure mind? Unless he had another few decades of hard practice and pondering, or immediately perform an operation on himself to work on his brain and soul. Otherwise, how could a person who had been so carefree for more than 10 years and didn't know what kind of ideas he would come up with in the next second become such a focused Taoist without any distracting thoughts in an instant? He had never thought of such a thing. It was after seeing through this that Elder Luo gave up on continuing to teach him and let him grow up as wild as he wanted. He only received 100,000 yuan. It was okay to teach him so much and lose so much money. It was not worth it to make his blood pressure and life expectancy suffer. Moreover, when it came to fighting and killing, Huaishi's comprehension was just average. Compared to Luo Xian, she was comparable to a stubborn rock. She could barely be considered average in terms of impressions. To be able to get to where he was now, he really didn't rely on his own understanding and talent. He relied on his other side, which was already at an unprecedented level of musical talent. Without the unreasonable skill of a musical performance, Huaisher would have been beaten to death in some corner long ago. How could he live until now? Olding, I'm just a piano player. At most, I'll be a conductor. You think too much. This is completely different from my professional requirements. Huaisher dodged awkwardly. If I really fix my mind on a voice and an instrument, the symphony can't be played. Then I'll still wait. While complaining, Huaisher's soul suddenly trembled. It was as if lightning flashed. He came to a realization. Who said that I can't focus if I have more? He muttered absent-mindedly, ignoring the hurricane behind his head. He rose into the air and skimmed over the poisonous and corrosive soup spurting out of the iron pot. He finally grasped something. It seemed that he understood again. Since different plans at the same time will cause chaos, then why don't we just arrange the order and priority? Different voices appearing at the same time was not important at all. The most important thing was the effect achieved after the combination. His limbs, bones, nerves, muscles, and even the circulation of origin substances and the rhythm of his soul. Just like how the high, middle, and low parts had to be combined in an orderly manner. The string section, wind section, percussion section, and color section. Take your positions, perform your duties, and follow your orders. Only then could the music be played smoothly. His thoughts went in circles from confusion to comprehension, then confusion, and finally comprehension again. However, he discovered that he had unknowingly returned to the starting point. Huaisher murmured in realization, "Isn't this symphonic music?" Ignoring the piercing pain that kept bursting out all over his body, the spear of compassion tore apart the gravy that was spreading on the ground and opened up a straight path on the ground that had been burnt red. Huaisher rushed in, brushing past the beheading bone saber and the giant shovel. The sword of virtue was raised again. It was aimed at the head chef's body. Head? For arms? Neck? Legs? Or the giant mouth in front of his chest? Were those distracting thoughts in the way? Was it necessary to have a pure thought? As his thoughts turned, the piercing pain continued to spread throughout his body. Origin substance surged, endlessly pouring into him. The light on the blade surged, illuminating Huaisher's smile. In that instant, Ing Fangzhou frowned and shook his head unhappily. "Wrong. No, that's right," Huaisher muttered. In this brief moment, he took a step forward and stabbed at his opponent in front of him. The sword of virtue cried out. Dozens of tiny cracks appeared on the blade, clanging and trembling. It was difficult for it to withstand the power that had been placed on its body in this brief moment. It was not just the power of the mountain ghost. The sky above, the earth below, and even Ing Fangzhou's lightning prison trembled slightly, merging into the rhythm that Huaisher had created. Heaven and earth resonated here. A melodious sound that was even louder than thunder erupted from the head chef's bloated body. In an instant, it pierced through. A massive crack appeared on the head chef's back, blood and shattered bones spewing out. The head chef, however, did not seem to notice. He continued to smile savagely as his giant hand suddenly grabbed Huaishi's arm. Meanwhile, he raised the giant bone blade in his other hand and aimed it at Huaishi's face. This time, I won't let you escape again. And Huaishi did not try to escape. He still stood in place. He only raised his head and gazed at his plump opponent with a slight smile, as if the battle had already ended. Immediately afterwards, the giant blade that was about to descend froze in the air. It froze. The head chef's expression suddenly changed. He opened his mouth, wanting to speak, but no sound came out. An intense tremor spread out from the wound. It was like a wave, causing the flesh to churn. The surging power and rhythm reverberated throughout his body. At first, it was just a faint and low mournful sound like a moan. But then, the fine line of sound suddenly burst out like a tide, sweeping and covering every inch of his limbs and bones. Even his own power and frozen soul were pulled into the unreasonable turbulence, becoming part of a chain reaction. With the bones as the pipe, the muscles as the string, the organs as the drum, and the lungs as the horn. In the end, it was like a resounding roar under the violently expanding mountain of flesh. The mighty melody galloped and reverberated wantonly, destroying his body and soul, producing this indescribably beautiful song. Inspired by the legendary Walpurgis Night, where witches danced and cast spells, the symphony composed by the Russian Federation composer Mussorgsky 200 years ago was called Night on the Barren Mountain. At this moment, with the head chef's bloated and massive body as the stage, the cries of the witches and demons, as well as the dark spirits, appeared once again. Accompanied by the eerie and solemn melody, they wantonly spread throughout his body. The bone cleaver, the giant shovel, the rolling pin, and the iron pot fell off from the twitching arm, followed by the skin and rolled muscles, and even the broken bones. The tragic roars and screams blended into the melody that spread throughout his body, becoming a part of this cruel performance. The flesh and blood seemed to have come alive, singing loudly under Huaishi's mastery. The sound of cracking and shattering was endless, and cracks appeared on the huge body one after another. In the end, the head chef knelt on the ground with difficulty. His face, full of wrinkles, was filled with shock and fear. Incomprehensible. What is that? In the silence, Huaishi looked down at him, thought for a moment, and answered seriously. This is called art. Lightning flashed and disappeared. As the roar spread, the corpse that had lost its soul fell on its back, no longer making a sound. Huaishi, on the other hand, turned around and looked outside the dissipating thunder prison. Ing Fangzhou's face was gloomy. His smile was cheerful. "How was it?" he asked. Ing Fangzhou did not speak and did not even bother to answer him. He only felt that there must be something wrong with this person. The breakthrough was indeed a breakthrough, but why was it so infuriating? He had spent so much effort to bring this thing to the door of the realm of purity, but in the blink of an eye, this thing had reversed out of the warehouse. Moreover, it had sped all the way, growing wildly on an unexpected path and discovering this evil technique of using the opponent as a musical instrument. After integrating the power of self and the environment through the Supreme, he forcefully resonated with the opponent and then compressed the entire performance in an instant and poured it into the opponent's stomach. It showed what it meant to drag the opponent into the same realm and then defeat him with skillful experience. Just looking at Huaishi's smug look, he could not help but want to beat this thing up. But the other party had completed the trial he had set, and Ing Fangzhou, who was proud of his seniority, felt helpless. "What are you still standing there for?" Ing Fangzhou turned around angrily. "Let's go." Oh, okay." Huaishi nodded and chased after him. "But what did you think of my move just now? How was it?" "Under your guidance, I was indeed enlightened and instantly comprehended it. If not for your guidance, I would still—" Boom! Lightning suddenly burst out. A dazzling light descended from the sky and gathered in Ing Fangzhou's hand. The terrifying heat spread, and the ground under his feet was scorched black and melted. The premonition of death suddenly emerged in Huaishi's heart. And at that moment, Ing Fangzhou suddenly turned around, holding the lightning spear that gathered all the light in the sky, and aimed it at the stunned Huai Shi and flew out. Then it brushed past Huai Shi's stunned face and flew behind him. It was held in the hand of a long, dead, charred hand, and after half of the body was burned to ashes, it was completely crushed. Then the huge body on the ground suddenly stretched out its hand and pressed on Huai Shi's shoulder. It clenched. "Mr. Ing, your lightning seems to be as old as you. It's unbelievably old." A familiar voice sounded from the broken body, and a bloody and charred face stretched out from behind Huai Shi's shoulder and greeted him mockingly. The rotten flesh rolled, and a middle-aged face that he had never seen before appeared, but that evil smile and eyes full of madness and mockery made Huai Shi suddenly think of another name. "Golden Dawn Woodman. You finally recognized me?" Woodman, who was leaning on the broken body, grinned. "Long time no see. Huai Shi, did you miss me?" "Yes." Huai Shi smiled and nodded. "I missed you." At that moment, the outline of the sword of virtue reappeared, and the sharp blade penetrated his rotten face with irresistible force. Intense light burst out. Chapter 11:21. It was just like what he had done in the past. Without thinking or hesitation, he pierced the sharp blade into the face. Flames gushed out and burned everything. After tearing the disgusting smile apart, he stirred it up. No trace of the original face could be seen. He split it with the blade of the axe, raised it with the spear, and smashed it on the ground. He added a skyfall. Blood and flesh exploded. The remains fell on their backs, and the big mouth in front of their chest seemed to be curled up in joy. "Don't get excited." Woodman's ghost was still there. "I'm just here to say hello, and," he said, "to give you a surprise." At that moment, the corpse that was still intact under the destruction of Huai Shi and Ing Fangzhou suddenly collapsed and shrunk as if it was pulled by the gravitational force of a star. The bloated and huge body collapsed into a fist-sized piece of flesh suspended in the air. It moved a little and burst out with a low rumble like a heartbeat. "Get out of the way." Ing Fangzhou stretched out his hand and pulled Huai Shi back with infinite force. He didn't have time to catch it. He raised his other hand, grabbed the lightning spear that fell from the sky, and stabbed it down again. In the roar, lightning scattered in all directions. The charred flesh began to swell. A hand abruptly stretched out from the bloody flesh and clenched tightly. The bronze skin was covered with calluses and scars, as if it was made of metal. Just the appearance of a hand blocked Ing Fangzhou's full blow. Spell card: 6 Paths of Reincarnation. Reincarnation of the Hungry Ghost. In the distant independent realm, in front of Alistair, the heretic King Jie sat in the lotus position. His body shrank inwards. His thin body gradually shrank as he breathed. It was like yoga, but even the best yoga couldn't shrink the body to this extent. One of his arms had been crushed into meat paste under the weight of his body and the gravitational force of the mystic instrument. It disappeared in an instant and reconstructed from thousands of miles away. The arm that stretched out from the flesh raised. The slender fingers curled as if they were boneless and formed a wedge seal. It was like a lotus, like a raging fire. Chi. A mighty hurricane swept through the air, shaking the soul and shaking the will. Even Huai Shi, who was standing behind Ing Fangzhou, felt his vision darken. It was shaken by the origin substance emanating from the hand imprint. It was hard to breathe. Outside the chessboard, Isaac frowned slightly. The card in his hand was spinning continuously at his fingertips. Eventually, he threw it back into the battlefield. "Miss Chun, sorry to trouble you." Wait for me." In the dispute zone, on the battlefield where flesh and blood were flying everywhere, the gigantic armored giant roared. In her hand, the burning sword of light in her hand slashed down, tearing the giant monster in front of her apart like a hot knife through butter. She lifted her foot and firmly stepped on the giant snake that was entangled with her. She grabbed the snake's head with both hands and suddenly twisted it. Blood spurted out like a waterfall, dyeing Anubis' metal face red. His scarlet eyes shone brightly. The huge ports and slots on the back opened up, and high-temperature steam gushed out. A large amount of cooling liquid evaporated like clouds. The car that fell from the sky landed on her back and turned into a huge weapon. As Anubis knelt on the ground, the heavy base on her back suddenly opened up. The pitch-black cannon barrel grew, forming an exaggerated scale of hundreds of meters. The entire battlefield shook. Countless amounts of blood gathered and disappeared from Anubis' halo. Instead, it was replaced by a suffocating dark aura. In Anubis' projection, blood, death, and origin substance continued to surge. In the core of the furnace, there was an intense, qualitative change. In the end, it condensed into a crystal cannonball engraved with the emblem of the jackal. Super long-range attack sequence. Dewey's Gate, go! The earth wailed and cracked. At the moment of firing, the terrifying heat burned Anubis' outer armor red. All the surrounding enemies were turned into charcoal. The huge cannon also collapsed under the impact of this overload. Only the cannonball flew out of the darkness like a phantom, breaking through the battlefield, the clouds, and the sky. After crossing 4,000 kilometers in the blink of an eye, it fell from the sky again like a phantom. It smashed into the arm that stretched out from the flesh. At that moment, the hand that was forming a seal trembled slightly, as if it could feel death descending from the sky. 5 fingers spread out, as if it was about to grasp something. The spreading hurricane contracted inwards. It was as if a crack leading to the vacuum of the universe had opened up. An irresistible suction force burst out from the palm, endlessly pulling everything around it into it. Dust, sand, blood, Huaishir's hair, and the cannonball that fell from the sky. Between the 5 fingers, everything was constantly collapsing, and collapsing. Even the slowly rising radiance could not escape the terrifying grip that had reached the realm of gravity, and it fell apart between the 5 closed fingers. Only the terrifying heat and impact between the fingers tore the earth apart, plowing out 4 scorch marks that spread for thousands of meters. The air was boiling. On the melted earth, other than Ying Fangzhou's lightning, there was only a piece of flesh that was expanding and contracting. It was gradually squeezing out the outline that once represented the peak of martial arts. Just like that, it faced the bombardment of lightning head-on. The heretic king broke through the air and arrived. His bare feet stepped on the melted earth, but there was no trace of injury. His body, which had rebelled against the laws of the universe with its own will, stood proudly on the earth. Only his right hand, which had just received Ying Fangzhou's lightning and Anubis cannonball, was dripping with blood. 4 of his fingers had been charred and broken bones could be seen on his palm. It was so tragic. Other than that, he was unscathed. The moment he raised his weather-beaten face, his eyes shot out killing intent that was so condensed that it was almost tangible. It hit Huaishir's soul across Ying Fangzhou. Ravage! Smack! With a soft sound, Huaishir's face was cut by a blade-like gaze. It was so deep that his bones could be seen. Then, a palm appeared in front of Huaishir. Yin Zhongjuan opened his palm and blocked the gaze of killing intent. The electric light around his body jumped, and there was a scarlet and black flame of anger. Now, the heretic king finally looked at Ying Fangzhou. It seemed to be a compliment. Not bad. What responded to him was the furious roar of the sky. Countless thunderbolts gathered out of thin air and pierced toward the mortal world. Lightning and thunder dragons danced endlessly under the outline of the Kunpeng projected in the clouds. The heavenly palace appeared. Looking down at the enemy in front of him, Yin Zhongjuan lowered his eyes contemptuously and asked, "Evil heretic, are you worthy?" Tens of thousands of thunderbolts gathered in his hand, and the outline of the metal rapidly grew and extended, forming an armor that was between illusion and reality. When the ethereal tip of the spear cut through the air, it burst out with the roar of a vast and mighty river. Hateful water. The surging Yangtze River flows east, and the waves wash away the heroes. Now, the heroes of the past reappeared here and launched an attack on the opponent in front of them. The heavenly palace rang, and the thunderbolts that filled the sky instantly converged. After endless purification, they were dyed from white to pure black and shrouded in Fangzhou's body. Lightning flashed. Without any warning, the Heretic King's figure flickered on the spot. Only continuous roars could be heard, and it was difficult to distinguish between them. At that moment, he seemed to have grown countless arms. At the top of each left arm, the 5 fingers spread out and formed a different wedge seal, resisting the attack that was above the lightning without giving way. Suddenly, the Heretic King's face turned from yellow to red. He opened his mouth and roared loudly. Lion's roar. Rolling sound waves spread out. The sound waves that were imbued with source substance and some unknown supreme actually caused the lightning to pause for a moment. Then, the Heretic King's figure disappeared on the spot. Only a series of footprints were left behind, deeply wedged into the soil and rocks. The strange and winding footsteps faintly resembled Yu's footsteps, but they were even more complicated and swift than Yu's footsteps. It stretched straight towards Huaishe and extended all the way. Before that, Huaishe's hair was already standing on end. The premonition of death shrouded in front of him, and it was like a needle piercing his soul and causing him to tremble and fall into panic. His target was himself, but the moment he reacted, the Heretic King had already rushed to within 3 steps of him. 3 steps, 16 meters. It might seem like a long time, but to an opponent like the Heretic King, it was no different from being right in front of him. At that moment, Huaishe recalled the first time he went to the orchard gym and sparred with Elder Luo. It was so similar. With such a short distance, even if he retreated, there was no meaning in it. The moment he turned around, he would be punched to death, and his heart would be crushed into meat paste. The only choice left was to fight head-on. Over-limit mode, activate. In an instant, his face burned red, and his incomplete hair stood up like needles. The flames of the axe of wrath reignited at his fingertips. Within a few thousand meters, everything seemed to have fallen into a dead silence. There was no more sound. All the vibrations, waves, and sounds gathered in Huaishe's chest. Even the thunder in the dark clouds above the dome. Benefiting from the experience of Yun Zhongjian and the cooperation from Fangzhou, he absorbed the power that was thousands of times greater than himself into his body. The skin all over his body was broken, his bones cracked, his muscles screamed, and his blood evaporated. In exchange, he transcended the realm of the mountain ghost and was not inferior to Huaishe at his peak. Mastery, symphony, the sound of fates knocking overlapped at that moment. The blade of the axe and the iron fist collided. A crack actually appeared on the heretic monarch's golden body. In the rumbling sound, Huaishe was sent flying. Blood spurted out from his mouth and nose, and the skin all over his body exploded. He was almost a bloody man. However, the Heretic King stopped in his tracks. He was stunned for a moment. Although the slash of the symphony was enough to injure him, he did not hold back at all in that punch. Now, Huaishe did not explode from his punch. In Huaishe's hands, the axe of wrath shattered inch by inch and disappeared without a trace. His soul was heavily damaged. Before the Heretic King's power completely exploded, the axe of wrath, which was the medium that transmitted the power, had already self-destructed under Huaishe's will. The remaining shockwaves could no longer take away Huaishe's life. At best, it was just a heavy injury. However, under the replenishment of life force from the garland on his wrist, Huaishe's HP bar began to recover rapidly. He actually survived, feeling the burst of power and the use of mastery from his grand disciple in that instant. The Heretic King, who had always hated Huaishe to the core, could not help but change his view of him. Not bad. After that moment of delay, the purified thunder spear of resentment had already descended from the sky. Yun Zhongjuan's rage and destructive power were fully displayed in that instant. The iron fist of his left arm collided with the spear. The soil beneath the Heretic King's feet also showed signs of spreading cracks. On the monk's upper body, the linen robe finally could not withstand the continuous impact and instantly fell apart. revealing his shriveled upper body and bundles of muscles that looked as if they were made of iron wires. There was even a wound on his chest that cut his abdomen open. From his collarbone to his abdomen, the wound that was cut by the blade was no longer bleeding. It was forcibly closed under the control of superhuman muscle control. If one did not pay attention, they would have thought that it was a thin thread. However, there was still the horrifying aura of slaying ghosts and slaying gods on the wound. Even the heretic king who had the ultimate secret technique could not heal it. Instead, under the impact of the current impact, the wound continued to burst open, revealing the organs that were heavily injured. The sword mark from the sword saint still remained on the heretic king's body. Mastery, thoughtless heaven. Chapter 1122. Under the burning volcano, a solemn and ancient city was shrouded in dark clouds. Streams of flame constantly rose from the burning mountains, hovered in the clouds, and fell like clouds. The air was filled with the pungent smell of sulfur. Under the snow-like volcanic ash, Pompeii still stood on the ground. It was a city formed by combining many buildings, including military camps, law enforcement offices, bathhouses, and even temples. With an inexhaustible supply of energy and the protection of the molten furnace, the sound of hammering iron could be heard from within the workshop at all times. Divine weapons were produced from within the workshop, and they were constantly being equipped in the hands of a large group of people. At the highest point of the city, halfway up the mountain, in the pitch-black basalt fortress, there was a refreshing tea fragrance. I didn't expect to be able to drink such good tea in a place like this. The young swordsman, sitting on the opposite side of the somewhat rough table, raised the silver cup in his hand and took a deep breath. He could not help but sigh as he felt the comfortable feeling of the fragrance lingering in his heart. Shang Quan nodded. "Thank you, Lord Vulcan, for your hospitality. Don't mention it." Opposite him, the bearded man in linen clothes laughed heartily. "Since we are fortunate enough to meet, of course we have to entertain you. I just don't know why Mr. Sword Saint would come to such a remote place, especially in such an exaggerated way." At the mention of the scene where Shang Quan fell from the sky, Vulcan's face was full of amazement and curiosity. "What is this?" he asked solemnly. "Could it be that the weapon mentioned in the Yingzhou genealogy, the human cannon, is it true?" This is a bit of a long story." Shang Quan wanted to say something, but stopped. He smiled awkwardly, picked up the silver cup, and drank it in one gulp. Vulcan picked up the gorgeous and exquisite golden pot on the table and tilted it slightly. Fresh tea flowed out continuously from it. What was strange was that when the golden pot turned around and aimed at the mouth of his cup, what flowed out was a rich, amber-colored liquor. "Tell me in detail." Vulcan leaned forward. "Take your time. There's no rush." "To be honest, I was punched here by someone," Shang Quan said awkwardly. Shang Quan replied awkwardly. "I originally thought that the opponent was just so-so, but in the end, I was careless and lost. This world is really scary." "Huh!" Along with the sound of something breaking, something round fell into Shang Quan's teacup, stirring up a circle of ripples, undulating up and down. That was an eyeball? There was still a strand of nerve tissue behind it. Vulcan raised his head in a daze and saw the empty space behind Shang Quan's left eye. "What the hell?" "Oh, it's nothing. It's just a small problem." Shang Quan reached out her hand and calmly picked up her eyeball from the teacup. After rinsing it, she stuffed it back into her eye socket. After 2 hits, the empty eye sockets began to move slightly. It was as if he had returned to his original state. However, as his head swayed, his chin accidentally dislocated and fell to the ground. Soon, he was straightened again. "I haven't felt this way for many years." Shan Xuan sighed softly. "After suddenly regaining my youth, I underestimated the heroes of the world. I was punched in the face when I wasn't paying attention. Even now, my brain is still a little shaky. Gaia's blood has probably been taken away, right? One punch. Hit me?" Vulcan felt that there was something wrong with his ears. "Yes." He sipped the tea that had a faint rusty taste and seemed to be lamenting, "Sure enough, there is always someone better than you. It seems that we still need to be patient and ask for more advice from our seniors." Volka did not say anything. He held his wine cup and looked at the guest in front of him. Was it an occupational disease or an illusion? In that moment of trance, the figure reflected in his eyes was no longer the figure with a faint smile, but the ferocious gaze of a ferocious beast amidst a sea of blood and a mountain of corpses. At his waist, the sharp blade in the scabbard whistled in a low voice. It was like a long sigh of hunger. It said that it must kill him. The moment his clothes were torn, the topless heretic king took a step forward indifferently. Ignoring the old wound on his chest that was deep into his bone marrow, he raised his left arm and blocked Yun Zhongjuan's thunderbolt. He only bent down slightly. His right hand, with forbroken fingers and exposed white bones, hung down. Only his undamaged palm was pressed against the ground. His palm was gently pressed against one another. It was like touching a leaf. The heretic king's shriveled abdomen suddenly swelled up like a balloon. He shook his arm slightly and pressed it down. Huh! Then a loud sound of a landslide burst out from under his palm. The earth wailed, trembled, and spasmed. Under the impact of the impact that was comparable to a missile bombardment, layers of waves rose from the solid soil and spread in all directions like a tide. Wherever it passed, dust and pebbles flew up. It easily penetrated the deepest part of the earth hundreds of feet below. Explode. At that moment, the connection between the sky and the earth was cut off. A huge gap appeared in the cycle that belonged to Yun Zhongjuan. The thunder prison that sealed the surroundings trembled violently and was destroyed. The monk broke out of the cage. There were still flashes of lightning on his withered face. His shriveled body stepped on the empty air and stood above the sky, punching toward Fangzhou. Tens of thousands of thunderbolts were shattered. In the dark clouds, the heavenly palace surged, and the mighty wail song rose from the sea of clouds. The shadow of the Kuan Peng appeared around Fangzhou. The tip of the spear pierced out and collided with the iron fist without flinching. Only endless flashes of lightning could be seen in the sky. The pitch-black clouds pressed down inch by inch, like an iron curtain, endlessly drawing closer to the ground. And in this increasingly narrow space, accompanied by the sound of thunder, a torrential rain poured down. The heavy rain instantly covered everything that Huaisher could see. It took away all the heat and frost spread. Amidst the endless rain, Lord Yun Zhongjuan's ever-changing figure could be seen. It was difficult to see where he was. It was as if he was everywhere. The heretic king fell to the ground like a meteorite. The frost on his limbs spread and was casually shattered. He frowned slightly. He couldn't believe that he had slowed down. But soon he reacted. It was not that he had been frozen and slowed down. It was his opponent, who was getting faster and stronger. The water-hate thunder flashed and disappeared. It slashed down from the clouds. Wherever it passed, the rain was cleanly cut into two. The heretic king's golden body shook violently. A loud chime was heard from his body. In the storm, a thunderbolt suddenly appeared. It bounced, refracted, and flashed between the raindrops without any pattern. In the end, the entire world was filled with the dazzling lightning. Then, heaven and earth closed. It was hard to imagine what kind of terrifying defense and supreme tier ability could withstand hundreds and thousands of water-hate attacks in an instant. In that instant, the body that was far stronger than gold and iron had many more small wounds. Viscous blood flowed out from the wounds. Soon, it was washed away by the storm. It was like a punishment. The golden body that he had obtained through his ascetic training was broken again. Purify, huh? The heretic king sighed. In that instant, he saw the essence of the lightning. It actually turned the enemy into a whetstone to sharpen the blade. Should he say that it was arrogant or terrifying? Under the lock of the heavenly fault, the lethality of the lightning spear would increase endlessly until either the user or the enemy was completely turned into ashes. Before that, it would only become stronger as the battle continued. If that was the case, then he would break the heavenly fault. Old Ing, be careful. In that instant, Huaisher coughed up blood and roared in a sorry state. The moment the heretic king straightened his body, he caught a glimpse of a familiar aura from the movement of his muscles. It was the same way as the drummer, but it was beyond Huaisher's understanding. It was even more violent and terrifying than he could imagine. But there was no doubt that this posture had never changed. The sky fell. In an instant, the scorching heat rose and spread around his body, melting the frost and snow. On the withered face, the pair of dark eyes had turned blood red. They were like burning flames, shooting out radiance. There was no fancy or disguise. Just like that, he punched toward the sky. Then, the sweeping wind swept away countless raindrops and scattered in all directions. The dark clouds and the iron curtain trembled violently, and a huge crack appeared in the middle. The heavenly fault was damaged. The rain stopped abruptly, and the light of the setting sun shone through the crack. When it landed on the monk's body, it seemed to glow, making his face look as solemn as a Buddha. But now, the Buddha's brows were still tightly furrowed. He was full of confusion. No, that punch with all his strength just now should have been more than that. After reaching the realm of the heretic monarch, one would have perfect control over all of one's powers. Just like just now, that punch should have spread out after hitting, completely shattering the dark clouds in the sky and completely destroying the heavenly palace. But the change was not as he expected. Instead, it only tore a crack and disappeared without a trace. He looked up and saw the remaining raindrops falling from the sky. In a fleeting moment, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the raindrops, a thin and shriveled monk with snow-white eyebrows. That was not a trace of ice and snow, but a sign of aging. But this body should have been in the prime of his life when he was 30 years old. But now, when he sniffed the wind, he smelled a strange smell coming from the body that was strengthened by the golden embryo, a faint stench. Was he sweating? Was it excessive blood loss? Or was it an old wound? In the excitement of fighting a strong enemy, this body actually felt tired. Maybe it was both, but it was not important. It was poison. When the heretic king stopped controlling the contraction of his wounds, he finally saw the blood oozing out from the wounds all over his body. There was also a faint, dark green mixed in. The golden embryo that was protected by Brahma was actually infected and damaged by poison. In the moment of realization, he looked at Ing Fangzhou in front of him and the long spear in his hand that was surrounded by lightning. As the lightning dissipated, the long spear's outline was revealed again. Unknowingly, it no longer looked like it hated water. The poison from the green-crowned dragon spilled on the cracked cross-shaped spear, and on the ground, clusters of brilliant iris flowers bloomed. The spear of compassion, dumbfounded, behind the golden thigh, a mountain ghost that was passing by quietly looked over. This is called family sharing equipment. Chapter 11:23. Who said that only he could use his origin equipment, especially when he could no longer use it. The best choice was to give the weapon to someone who could use it to its fullest potential. The green-crowned dragon's breath of decay was not poison in the first place. Instead, it was the manifestation of decay and aging. Anyone who came into contact with it would begin to age at an unimaginable speed. If one were to use the game's mechanics to understand, it would not attack the HP bar. Instead, it would directly reduce the HP limit. Even with the Heretic King's resistance, he was still hit countless times by Ing Fangzhou's thousands of attacks in an instant. That body was now nearing the end of its lifespan. The leakless golden embryo was destroyed by itself. I see. The Heretic King nodded in realization. He was not angry, nor was he shaken. His withered face was as calm as ever. Such wisdom is indeed worthy of praise. He said, Huaisher, you did well. At that moment, Huaisher did not feel any joy or pride. The premonition of death once again engulfed him completely. It was as if he had fallen into the depths of a dark abyss. His soul trembled, and he found it difficult to breathe. Because in the eyes of the Heretic King, Everything in the world seemed to have disappeared. He did not even care about the strong enemies that were close at hand. Only Huaishir was left. 1 month, half a month, 1 week, 3 days, 1 day. Feeling his lifespan rapidly decreasing, the heretic monarch slowly exhaled the remaining breath in his lungs. The shriveled body spasmed as if it had been electrocuted. It quickly swelled, and his heartbeat was like thunder. The originally skinny and short silhouette slowly grew. In the end, it turned into a giant that walked out of the furnace, emitting endless heat. Supreme, praise wine. Supreme, Fanxing. Supreme, peace and tranquility. Countless skills that ordinary people could not imagine appeared and gathered in that broken body. It maintained the final time limit and completely froze its own time. Its power began to expand and increase in a self-destructive manner. Since there were still many cards left, he gave up on the idea of returning to receive treatment. Instead, he used this useless body as a consumable tool. There was only one thing left to do. Kill Huaishir. Let's go. Ying Fangzhou was even faster than him. The moment the heretic king entered his transformation, his figure appeared hundreds of meters away. He stretched out his hand and grabbed Huaishir, pulling him up from the ground. Ignoring the mountain ghost's endurance, he threw him out with all his might. The sound of cannonballs breaking through the air rang out. Huaishir didn't even have time to scream before he was crushed by the oncoming wind pressure and went into shock. After a short moment, he saw everything quickly moving away. Yin and yang stimulated each other, and electricity generated magnetism. Under the ejection of the heavenly fault, he had already become a cannonball of an electromagnetic cannon and was shot out. But at that moment, the heretic monarch had already taken a step forward. The 10,000 Zhang thunder prison was completely shattered. The resentful water flashed out from the thunder and pierced through his body, but he didn't care about it at all. He allowed Yun Zhongjuan's thunderbolts to wreak havoc and destroy his body. The heretic king took another step forward and stomped on the ground. His huge body instantly shrunk into a ball. Immediately after, his toes, ankles, knees, and even his hip bones accelerated layer by layer, bursting forth with a terrifying speed that was not inferior to any spacecraft. It flew towards Huaishir. Don't even think about it. Yin Zhongjuan roared angrily. Frost and wind gathered, and the rain was like a blade, blocking the front of the broken body. However, whether it was the thunder prison, wind wall, endless rain, or the frost blades mixed in, none of them could stop the heretic king's advance. He was pierced through bit by bit. Even the air was smashed into a human-shaped gap. The heretic monarch's advance was faster than the speed of sound, leaving a pale and straight trail wherever he passed. His pure power was fully displayed at this moment. He took Ying Fangzhou's bombardment head-on, ignoring the repeated slashes and piercing of the blade of purification. Even though his body was already riddled with holes under the piercing of thunder and the burning of electric light, he still didn't falter or slow down. He had locked down his health and used a cheat. In the mighty roar of the sea, the outline of the Kunpeng once again appeared in front of the heretic king. The heavenly fault descended and condensed into a solid form. The towering Thunder City collided with the heretic king. However, after an instant of roar, the heretic king's figure mysteriously disappeared on the spot. After reappearing in the heavenly fault, his speed didn't slow down at all. In fact, he was even accelerating. Supreme tier, split air. Right in front of him was Huaishir, who had fallen to the ground. Then he raised his left hand that was full of wounds again and clenched his 5 fingers tightly. At that moment, even the heretic monarch, who was as cold as steel, couldn't help but feel a trace of pity. In the future, he might be able to become the successor of the heretic king's legacy, right? What a pity today. I will kill your soul with my own hands right here and now. Supreme tier, spirit, urge. In an instant, the soul-killing fist that could destroy the consciousness of all opponents and cause them to fall into eternal slumber brazenly smashed down. Electric light flashed, and the sound of steel shattering burst forth. The hate water spear wailed and shattered inch by inch. The lightning that had been purified to the extreme exploded, completely destroying his left arm and evaporating it. The heretic king didn't hesitate. He raised his broken right hand again and aimed his remaining thumb at Huaishi's face. Then, he thrust it forward like a spear. A cold voice sounded. The heretic king said, "Dream on." At that moment, blood spurted out and dyed Huaishi's face red. Ing Fangzhou, right in front of Huaishi, the arrogant figure trembled. A tragic hole had been pierced through his chest, and one of his arms was cut off. The lightning that filled the sky retracted from his other hand and aimed at the wound on the heretic king's chest. Then it blasted out and seeped into the heretic king's heart. The lightning rose and gushed out like a waterfall from the wound left by the sword saint. It destroyed the remaining life force from the inside out. The heretic king's movement finally stopped in place. He didn't move anymore. However, on the charred body, the broken eye blinked with difficulty, revealing the last of its spirit and ferocity. Then a voice that was close by sounded. It was an order from Ing Fangzhou. He said, "Huaishi." At that moment, behind Ing Fangzhou, Huaishi no longer hesitated. He seized this short opportunity and stabbed forward with the sword of virtue, piercing through Ing Fangzhou's body. From bottom to top, it stabbed diagonally into the heretic king's throat and wedged into the gap between the cervical vertebrae. Forward again. Decapitation. This was the last straw that crushed the heretic king's body. Crack. With the soft sound of a bubble bursting, the head that was full of cracks fell from the shoulder, and the body fell to the sky. There was no more sound. At the last moment, only a sigh of pity was left. Very good. As the nirvana stopped, the heretic king's corpse began to swell violently. Then it collapsed and quickly disintegrated. Endless blood turned into a torrent and gushed out like a waterfall. In the end, it formed a scarlet river. Huaishi couldn't be bothered to admire the strange scenery anymore. He propped himself up with the sword and supported the fallen Ing Fangzhou. Then, he slowly placed him on the ground. Hey, old Ing, can you hear me? Hang in there, hang in there. Huaishi swung his hand and threw the flower wreath on his wrist into the river of blood behind him. In an instant, the roots of the plants spread in the blood and grew rapidly. They actually bloomed into pitch-black lotus flowers. The black lotus flowers with golden edges grew and died. All the vitality gathered in Huaishi's hand along the mountain ghost network. He didn't heal himself first. Instead, he turned around and wrapped the roots around Ing Fangzhou's body, trying to extend his life. Unfortunately, no matter how much vitality was injected, Yin Zhongjuan's injuries still didn't improve. In the wound on his chest, where the heretic king had pierced through, fragments of his bones and internal organs kept falling out. The killing intent from the abyss still lingered in it, lingering. It couldn't grow or heal at all. In fact, even his heart had stopped beating. He was on the verge of death. It's just a small injury. Why are you panicking? Ing Fangzhou looked up and glanced at him. He reprimanded in a hoarse voice, "Outrageous. Why are you still so stubborn at a time like this, old Ing?" Huaishi was infuriated. "Can you stop pretending? This is the second time you've died, and you still want to tell me that you have experience? Can't you just listen to my advice for once? Get out of the way." Ing Fangzhou raised his only arm and slapped Huaishi away. He used the last of his strength to reach into the wound on his chest and hold his heart tightly. Then, a dazzling electric light flashed. Bang! Accompanied by a low sound, the dying body suddenly shook and blood spurted out of the wound. Then, another low sound was heard. A third time, a fourth time. When Ing Fangzhou's palm slowly loosened, the heart that was full of cracks had resumed beating. Then, his palm roughly wiped the wounds on his chest and shoulder, forcibly gouging out the traces of the heretic king's destruction. Under the dazzling electric light, all the wounds were covered with a layer of scorch marks. It was the first time Huaishi saw such a hardcore surgery. He was already stunned. Electric shock pacing, removing the lesion, suturing the wound. It was unknown how many times he had done it, but Ing Fangzhou did it smoothly and smoothly. When he came to his senses, Yin Zhongjuan was already out of the dying state. Now, he looked at him from the corner of his eyes, scrutinizing. What did you just call me? Huaishir blinked and squeezed out an innocent smile. I forgot. In a long silence, Ying Fangzhou looked at him. After a long time, he sighed softly and said nothing. Help me up, he said. The two of them did not stay in the same place for long. Now, in order to protect Huaishir, Ying Fangzhou took the heretic king's all-out sacrificial punch and was completely injured. He was out of danger. However, he did not know what kind of supreme effect it was, but the wound could not be healed at all. He could only barely maintain his condition. No one knew what kind of opponent would use evil methods to descend from the sky. They had just sent away the most basic, ascetic. If the opponent turned around and used the heretic king, which was the real one after falling into the abyss, they were afraid that they would die here. After taking back the garland again, Huaishir carried Ying Fangzhou on his back and trudged all the way. Soon, the motorcycle that was left in the same place was dug out of the ground again. Fortunately, the frame was still intact. There were also backups for the few broken parts. After a little cleaning, it could still be driven. The quality was so high that it was really touching. However, the person sitting in the back of the motorcycle this time was Ying Fangzhou. Huaishir took out a piece of cloth that was stuffed in the corner and carefully covered him with it. Just as he was about to move, he heard Ying Fangzhou's voice. The situation now is different from when we set off. Yin Zhongjuan, who was seriously injured, asked softly, Can you still walk, Huaishir? Of course. Huaishir covered the corner of the stall and replied calmly. We're already here, aren't we? Ying Fangzhou sighed softly. It's up to you to decide, he said. I'm afraid I can't protect you. Huaishir. Okay. Huaishir stretched out his hand, twisted the accelerator, and started the motorcycle. As the motorcycle vibrated, he held the helmet in his hand and was silent for a while. Suddenly, he said, Actually, I know how to repair things like machinery, I know, Ying Fangzhou said. Huaishir thought for a moment and said seriously, I can work harder. I know. Ying Fangzhou nodded. Huaishir laughed and finally said to him, Also, thank you. Ying Fangzhou was silent for a long time. Okay, he said. I'm tired. I'll rest for a while. With that, he leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes, and stopped talking. It was as if he had fallen asleep. Huaishir lowered his head, put on the helmet, and pulled down the mask. I'm sorry, Mr. Isaac. He whispered softly, I don't care about other things. Huh? The vice principal's puzzled voice sounded. This time, I'm afraid the task of saving the world will be handed over to you, Huaishir said expressionlessly. I'm going to kill those stupid Golden Dawn bastards. After a short silence, there was a pleasant laughter. There was no resistance or displeasure. It was full of indulgence. Come on, he said. Thus, the motorcycle rumbled. Dust was raised. It drove into the distance again. Chapter 1124. That's about the situation. The vice principal's message came from the other side of the battlefield. Madam Chun, it seems like you'll have to take charge of this side. Are you finally getting a little motivated? On the top of the squatting steel giant, the wind with the scent of blood blew the metal earrings, and a crisp sound was heard. Madam Chun spat out a mouthful of thick smoke with the smell of diesel from the gap between her teeth. She grinned. That kid looks lazy, but he's still ambitious. But since he doesn't need my help, I won't hold back then. You could do whatever you want. No one will doubt your talent. Isaac calmly stretched out his hand and threw out another frame card, shrouding the Creator's law in the silent battlefield. Layers of buildings rose from the ground between the blood and the corpses of the hell creatures. In the distance, on the peak of the mountain range, the wilderness covered in snow, the deep lake, and the turbulent ocean, the top of the outposts lit up. Countless lights surged in the sky, connecting with the transfer stations scattered all over the fragment, once again forming a brand new network of origin substance. Wherever it passed, all the blood, corpses, and even the tragic scene disappeared, and everything rose from the light. At this moment, the battlefield full of cracks and burn marks seemed to have been purified by the light, turning into a paradise on earth. Between the open books, a pure white tower that was no different from the land of dreams gathered. It was not established by a book or a person's words, but by countless records of things and history. They merged and intersected with each other, and the miracle of things refined by things appeared again. Human intelligence barrier, ivory tower. The lights of the past were lit up again, and behind the open door, the white doves from hell returned once again. Everything is ready, Madam Chun. The purser from the Iron Crystal waved at Anubis from the top of the building. All equipment adjustments have been completed. Along the tracks, dozens of maintenance vehicles dragged the huge steel giant and sent it into the brand new workshop. Under the cover of hundreds of mechanical arms, the old armor was removed, revealing complicated cables and structures. They changed the source furnace, corrected the strength of the bones, replenished the supply of origin substance, and more importantly, changed the radar and engine. The brand new equipment was embedded into the sleeping giant's body like internal organs. The wolf's iron face became even colder and more ferocious, and the four eyes shot out scarlet light again. Flashing electric sparks fell from the huge welding torch. Madam Chin looked up at the giant in front of her, raised her hands, and tried to clench her fists. As if she could feel the power surging in the giant's body, her smile became excited. "Thank you, old Jiang. What are you talking about?" "It's my duty." The purser shrugged helplessly. "But it will be better if you could change the way you address me. Won't that make us seem familiar?" Madam Chun put her hand on his shoulder. "Didn't you call me Xiao Chun before?" The purser smiled mischievously. "And should I call you Little Jing or All One?" After a short moment of silence, Madam Chin's expression gradually became more amiable. "Then we can only go and practice." Fine. I won't talk about this anymore. You're already the vice principal, but you still beat up the elderly all day. I think this celestial genealogy is finished." The purser waved his hand and begged for mercy. "Let's talk about business." "Business? Fight, build houses, recruit people, then do more fights, build more houses, recruit more people. Isn't this the right thing to do?" Madam Chun moved her body on the spot, nimbly stretching her body. She suddenly asked, "Where's the closest enemy?" "To the east." The purser replied without hesitation. "It's 1,200 kilometers in a straight line. There are a total of 16 large groups and 2 legions. It seems that they're already Tier 5 consolidators. It won't be easy to take them down. Isn't that good? There's only a challenge when there's difficulty. It's much easier than someone going to challenge Golden Dawn alone." Madam Chun stepped on the ladder and jumped onto Anubis' knee. With a nimble flip, she stepped on the cockpit. She turned around and asked, "How many people are here now?" The purser lowered his head and looked at his watch. "Mr. Liu, Mr. Adrian, and Ms. Fuji are all ready. White Dream should be back in half an hour. 2 white doves, 1 gray stork, and 1 black whale. This lineup shouldn't be a problem, right? What about you?" Madam Chin asked. "Aren't you going to move?" "I originally wanted to, but unfortunately, it's time for tea." The purser spread his hands and smiled. "I'm afraid you'll have to do more work. Tisk, they're all a bunch of lazy bums." She shook her head and jumped into the cockpit. Accompanied by the sound of steel rubbing against each other, the squatting steel giant opened the ceiling and stood on the ground again. It took a step forward. It caused the ground to shake. Dust flew everywhere, and a crack suddenly appeared in the huge square. Just behind the huge gate, in the darkness under the ground, sparks flew on countless steel frames and rails. Accompanied by the screeching sound of steel rubbing against each other, a strong wind rose from the depths of the ground. Wrapped by steel cables and dust-proof cloth, a slender and huge sealed cabinet popped out from under the rails. It was even dozens of meters taller than Anubis. From the cracks of the sealed cabinet, wisps of pale, cold air leaked out, causing the temperature of the entire square to drop. When Anubis reached out his hand and connected to the system, the complicated origin form matrix and the secret key were combined together. Ms. Chun, account login complete. Authorization verification complete. Accompanied by the urgent alarm, The sealed cabinet began to collapse and crack. When pieces of heavy steel plates fell to the ground, the machinery sleeping in the extreme cold and darkness seemed to be alive. Dozens of cables extended and wrapped around Anubis' arm. They grew upwards and connected to the dozens of plugs on its back. Dozens of bolts were nailed into the giant skeleton. Then, welding light burst out. The metal expanded as if it was alive and covered Anubis' body. It was like the giant had put on a charging armor. It was seamless and had ferocious edges. In the end, on Anubis' right hand, the huge object shrunk in the cabinet was like a ferocious beast. It glowed and roared. Its curled body completely unfolded, turning into a ferocious weapon more than 94 meters long. "How do you feel?" Simmons' voice came from the communication device. A happy whistle sounded. "That's great. Then I'll wait here for the good news, madam." "Don't give me that." This nickname was given to me by these guys. In the cockpit, the pilot clicked her tongue and pressed the last button. "The MS in my login name is not the abbreviation of Miss at all. Isn't this quite interesting?" Simmons smiled and finally said, "No matter what, I wish you a happy hunt." "Don't worry, I will." The sublimator raised her head and allowed the cold cable to be inserted into her spine. A burning pain erupted from her soul. In the cockpit, the tiny body seemed to have turned into ashes in an instant in the furnace. What replaced it was an armored giant standing on the ground. In her hand, the tip of the weapon that looked like a giant spear spewed out a dazzling scarlet. As she waved it, a low whistling sound spread out and left a flag-like trail in the air. Verification complete. Authorization approved. Level 6 drive. Dragon spear form release. Annihilation echo. Dragon summoning flute. Activate. Just like countless times in the past, Anubis opened its mouth and swallowed the killing intent from the underworld. It roared silently. Thus, under the push of the dazzling fire, it rose into the air. Mobile suit. Chen Wenjing attack. In the land of the Great Swamp, on both sides of the vast river, thick fog shrouded everything like a curtain. No one could see the changes clearly. No matter how close they were, they could only see the constantly changing silhouette in the mist. It was like a mountain range, like a palace in the sky, like a building. However, under the cover of the fog, there was only a lush and dense forest. Among the countless giant trees that could hardly be hugged by two people, there were many antique palaces and pavilions. And right in front of the main hall, on the square, a stream of light suddenly descended from the sky. The card from the present realm was here, but this time 4 figures of different heights and sizes fell out of it. With a bang, they rolled on the ground as if they were carsick and staggered. F***CK. Who's going to respond to Super Shurji next time? The thin and tall one who was pressed at the bottom coughed violently. For people sharing a card, it feels so crowded. There are 800 people sharing a card, and I don't see anyone complaining. You should look at your own problem. Hey, you're stepping on my hand. Move, my leg is about to break. The sublimator at the bottom struggled with difficulty. When he raised his head and saw the helpless waiting beside him, his eyes lit up. Enlightened Lord, quickly pull me up. The white-haired, middle-aged man helplessly stretched out his hand, and in any case, separated the entangled fellows. Although he had given many instructions, no matter how many times he did it, he couldn't help but sigh. It was really too much for their limbs to be so slack. And after they got up, they began to look around. Oh, F***CK. Even the one king's spirit enclosure was taken down? It's a wonder the country. This thing isn't easy to use. At least dig a few layers below. Look at our Jixia. There's always a basement under the basement. What's the Wi-Fi? I still have to organize the Mo King support today. Enlightened Lord. Do you have an umbrella? I feel like I'm about to die from the sun. Looking at these people who are either giving advice, curious babies, or dying. Enlightened Lord just wanted to cover his face and sigh. After so many years, the people had changed, and this generation's Jixia, 4 prodigies were still the same. Azure Sun, Zhu Ming, Baizong, Xining. With the 4 seasons as their names, They represented the four legacies that had been passed down from the era of the gods to the present day in Jixia Academy. The four essences of Eastern Xia's orthodox alchemy. Alchemy, sword forging, wondrous artifacts, and yin-yang transformation. It was a pity that none of the four types required contact with society. All of them were just squatting at home. After thousands of years of inheritance, countless generations of inheritors had just opened their eyes in Jixia and never thought of going out in their entire lives. Ever since the previous generations Lu Wu pulled in the internet cable, there was no need to mention it. Unless they took a delivery, they would lose if they took a step out of the door. This time, Ting had spent a lot of effort to drag them out of their nest. Apart from the weird temperament and the incomprehensible way of thinking that only the otakus of Jixia could understand, what stood here now was an encyclopedia of all the secrets, spells, smithing, and production techniques of Dongxia since ancient times. It was not an exaggeration to call it the crystallization of civilization. With just a casual glance, they knew all the details of the secret rituals that enlightened Lord had painstakingly designed. This allowed Kaming to heave a sigh of relief. With such a character in charge, he would not have to worry about the logistics anymore, as he was only there to make up the numbers. Everyone, please follow me. The old lady and Mr. Kwafu are still waiting. Enlightened Lord turned around and led the way. I need your help with some work. Do we need to prepare anything in advance? Xian Ying, who was the most proficient in yin-yang transformation and secret rituals, asked. Some rituals still require fasting and burning of the meter. It's most convenient if it doesn't involve sacrifice, but I'm afraid there will be problems if the materials are not available. Enlightened Lord's expression froze. He wanted to say something, but stopped. In the end, he just waved his hand. Don't worry, it's not that troublesome. It's just planting trees. Planting trees? Azure Sun was stunned. Then what we need Kwafu for? After a long silence, Enlightened Lord awkwardly looked away and into the distance. To be planted, that you're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.